Northwest, and Samuel Crawford stood alone before a modest granite headstone in the quieter section of Evergreen Memorial Cemetery. The stone read simply, Helen Marie Crawford, beloved wife and mother, 1988-2022. 3 years had passed since he lowered her into this earth, and still his boots felt rooted to this spot every Sunday morning before the sun fully crested the Cascade Mountains. He held a single white rose in his weathered hand, the petals still wet with morning dew, and he placed it gently against the cold stone where a dozen others had wilted and been cleared away by groundskeepers who never knew the woman beneath. Sam was 38 years old, though the lines carved into his face suggested a man who had lived several lifetimes compressed into less than 4 decades. His brown hair had begun to gray at the temples, and his hands bore the calluses of manual labor accumulated over 15 years of maintenance work, plumbing repairs, and whatever honest employment he could find to keep a roof over his daughter's head. He wore a faded navy jacket that had seen better days, work boots scuffed beyond any polish's redemption, and jeans worn thin at the knees from countless hours spent kneeling to fix things other people had broken. The cemetery was empty at this hour, which was precisely why he came so early. Sam had never been comfortable with witnesses to his grief. He had learned long ago in places far from this peaceful hillside that a man's tears were his own business, and the world had no patience for warriors who wept. His voice emerged rough and low, barely above a whisper. I'm still here, Helen, still keeping my promise. The wind stirred through the cedar trees that lined the cemetery's eastern boundary, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and the distant sound of traffic beginning its Sunday crawl along Interstate 405. Sam closed his eyes and let the memories wash over him, not fighting them anymore the way he had in those first terrible months after her death. He had learned that grief was not an enemy to be defeated, but a companion to be acknowledged, and Helen had taught him that lesson in her final weeks when she held his hand and told him that loving someone meant carrying a piece of them forward even when the weight seemed unbearable. He thought about Emma, their daughter, still asleep in the small apartment in Redmond, where a home health aide named Rosa would be arriving in an hour to begin her morning care routine. Emma was 5 years old now, the same age Helen had been when her own mother died of the same cancer that would eventually claim her. The cruel symmetry of it haunted Sam in his darker moments, but he had promised himself he would not let bitterness consume the love he still carried. Emma had been diagnosed with spastic quadriplegic cerebral palsy at 8 months old, the result of a brain injury during a complicated delivery that had nearly killed both mother and child. The doctors at Seattle Children's Medical Center had delivered the news with practiced compassion, explaining that Emma would likely never walk, never speak in complete sentences, never live what society callously termed a normal life. They had handed Sam and Helen pamphlets about care facilities and support groups, had scheduled follow-up appointments with specialists whose fees would eventually drain every savings account they possessed. But Helen had looked at their daughter lying in that hospital bassinet, had watched Emma's tiny fingers curl around her thumb, and had spoken words that Sam would carry with him until his own final breath. They can tell us what she won't do, but only God knows what she will. Sam opened his eyes and looked at the headstone once more. He reached out and traced Helen's name with his fingertip, feeling the letters carved into granite, permanent and unchanging, even as everything else in his life seemed to shift like sand beneath his feet. His mind drifted backward, as it often did in these quiet moments, to a time before Helen, before Emma, before he understood that love could be both the wound and the healing. He thought about the desert, about the endless expanse of Iraqi sand that had swallowed so many of his friends, about the weight of a rifle in his hands and the sound of incoming mortar fire that still sometimes jolted him awake at 3 a.m, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped animal seeking escape. Sam had enlisted in the United States Army at 19, 3 weeks after the towers fell, and the world changed in ways that would take years to fully comprehend. He had been young and angry and certain that serving his country was the only path that made sense for a kid from a broken home in Spokane who had no money for college and no prospects beyond the paper mill where his father had worked until the alcohol finally finished what decades of disappointment had started. The recruiter had promised him structure, purpose, brotherhood. What Sam found instead was a crucible that burned away everything he thought he knew about himself and left behind something harder. Something capable of surviving what no human being should ever have to witness. He served 2 tours in Iraq with the 101st Airborne Division, earning a Bronze Star for valor during the Second Battle of Fallujah, and a Purple Heart for shrapnel wounds that still ached when the Washington rain came heavy and cold. He had watched friends die in his arms, had pulled triggers that ended lives, had made decisions in fractions of seconds that would haunt him for decades. When he finally came home in 2008, he was 26 years old and felt ancient, hollowed out by experiences that civilians could never understand and that he could never adequately explain. The Veterans Administration diagnosed him with post-traumatic stress disorder, prescribed medications that made him feel like a ghost floating through his own existence, and assigned him to group therapy sessions where men with thousand-yard stares spoke haltingly about nightmares and flashbacks and the terrible guilt of having survived when better men had not. Sam attended for 6 months before the sessions began to feel like picking at wounds that would never heal, and he stopped going drifting, instead into a gray fog of isolation and odd jobs in cheap apartments where he could hear his neighbors arguing through walls thin as paper. He met Helen at Seattle Children's Medical Center in 2016, where he had taken a job as a maintenance technician because the work was steady and the environment reminded him less of war than construction sites or factories where the clang of metal triggered memories he preferred to keep buried. She was a pediatric nurse, 28 years old with auburn hair. She wore a practical ponytail and brown eyes that seemed to see straight through every wall he had built around himself. Their first conversation happened in a supply closet where Sam was replacing a faulty light fixture while Helen searched for a specific type of bandage for a young patient. She had asked him about his military service, noticing the faded Army tattoo visible beneath the pushed-up sleeve of his work shirt, and he had given his standard deflecting answer, something vague about serving overseas and being glad to be home. But Helen had not accepted the deflection. She had looked at him with those penetrating eyes and said simply, "My brother came back from Afghanistan different. I know that look." Something in her voice, some quality of understanding that went beyond mere sympathy, had cracked open a door that Sam had kept locked for nearly a decade. He found himself telling her about the nightmares, about the guilt, about the way he sometimes stood in grocery store checkout lines and planned escape routes in case of attack. Helen had listened without judgment, without the uncomfortable pity he had grown to hate, and when he finished, she had touched his arm gently and said, "You survived. That's not something to be ashamed of. That's something to honor by living." They were married 14 months later in a small ceremony at a chapel overlooking Puget Sound, with only a handful of guests and vows they had written themselves. Emma was born the following year, and for a brief shining moment, Sam allowed himself to believe that he had finally found the peace that had eluded him since the desert, that he could build something good from the wreckage of his past. Then Helen started losing weight she could not afford to lose, and the doctors found shadows on the scan, and the word pancreatic fell from their lips like a verdict with no appeal. Sam had not handled the diagnosis well. In fact, he had handled it in the worst possible way, defaulting to the cowardice he had hoped the Army burned out of him, retreating into himself like a turtle pulling into its shell. When Helen needed him most, when she was undergoing chemotherapy that ravaged her body and radiation that left her too weak to hold their daughter, Sam had fled. He had taken extra shifts, volunteered for overtime, found excuses to be anywhere but at home, where he would have to watch the woman he loved disappear piece by piece. It was his darkest shame, the memory that clawed at him in the small hours when sleep would not come. He had abandoned her, not physically, not entirely, but emotionally, spiritually. He had built walls when she needed bridges, had armored himself against the grief to come, instead of being present for the grief that was happening. Helen had confronted him 6 weeks before her death in their small living room, Emma asleep in the bedroom, and the television murmuring some late-night program neither of them was watching. She had taken his face in her thin hands, her skin papery and pale from the treatments, and she had spoken words that shattered him more completely than any combat experience ever had. "Sam Crawford, I am dying. That is not something you can fix or fight or run from. But I need you to hear me now because I don't have much time left to say it." He had tried to speak, to apologize, to explain the fear that choked him every time he looked at her diminishing form, but she had pressed a finger to his lips. "I know you're scared. I know you've seen too much death already, and watching me go feels like more than you can bear. But Emma needs her father. Not the ghost who drifts through this apartment avoiding eye contact. Not the soldier who retreats behind walls when things get hard. She needs you, Sam, the real you, the man I fell in love with." The tears had come, then the ones he had been holding back for months, and Helen had held him as he wept against her shoulder, her fragile arms somehow strong enough to contain his breaking. "I forgive you," she had whispered. "I forgave you weeks ago, but you need to forgive yourself, and you need to promise me something. Anything. Promise me you won't give up on Emma. Promise me you'll stay. Promise me that when things get hard, when every doctor tells you she can't do something, you'll remember that courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is staying when you want to run." He had promised. And in the weeks that followed, he had kept that promise, staying by Helen's side through the final terrible decline, holding her hand when she took her last breath in the hospice bed they had set up in their living room so she could watch the sun rise over the Cascades one more time. Now standing at her grave 3 years later, Sam renewed that promise silently the way he did every Sunday morning. He would stay. He would fight for Emma. He would not run no matter how hard things became. He did not yet know that within the week he would be tested in ways he could never have anticipated, that fate was about to present him with two more children who needed exactly what he had learned to give, and that the walls of a mansion in Bellevue Hills would become the unlikely setting for redemption he had stopped believing was possible. Sam kissed his fingertips and pressed them to Helen's headstone, then turned and walked back to his aging Honda Civic, the morning fog beginning to lift as the sun strengthened over the hills. The drive from the cemetery to the Hartwell estate took 45 minutes, winding through neighborhoods that transitioned from middle-class comfort to extravagant wealth with each passing mile. Sam had been working at the estate for 3 weeks now, hired through a staffing agency that specialized in placing workers in high-end residences where discretion was valued as highly as competence. The job paid well by his standards, nearly twice what he had made at the hospital, and the hours were flexible enough that he could arrange Emma's care without stretching his already thin budget past the breaking point. The Hartwell mansion emerged from behind a screen of ancient evergreens as Sam turned onto the private drive, and even after 3 weeks, the sight of it still gave him pause. The house was a Victorian-era monument to excess 47 rooms spread across 4 stories of brick and stone with turrets and gables and a wraparound porch that could have accommodated a small army. The grounds sprawled across 5 acres of manicured lawns and sculpted gardens with a fountain in the circular drive that probably cost more than every car Sam had ever owned combined. He parked in the staff lot behind the carriage house that had been converted into a garage, grabbed his work bag from the back seat, and made his way to the service entrance at the rear of the main house. The morning air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and Sam could smell wood smoke from one of the many chimneys, a reminder that despite its grandeur, this was still a home where people lived and breathed and struggled with problems that money alone could not solve. He had learned a great deal about the Hartwell family in his 3 weeks of quiet observation, absorbing information the way he had been trained to assess environments in hostile territory. The patriarch Richard Hartwell was a 70-year-old captain of industry who had built his fortune in medical technology and pharmaceutical distribution, a man whose photographs in the business publications lining the library walls showed cold eyes and a smile that never reached them. Richard lived in a separate wing of the estate with his wife Catherine, appearing in the main house only for formal dinners and meetings with staff that felt more like military briefings than household management sessions. The true mistress of the house was Victoria Hartwell, Richard's daughter-in-law and widow of his only son, Jonathan. Sam had seen her perhaps a dozen times in 3 weeks, always in passing, always dressed in expensive suits or designer casual wear that probably cost more than his monthly rent. She was beautiful in the way that wealthy women often were, with the kind of careful grooming and understated elegance that spoke of personal trainers and spa treatments in a life where physical imperfection was simply not tolerated. But there was something behind her eyes, a shadow that Sam recognized from mirrors and from the faces of men who had seen too much. Victoria Hartwell was haunted by something, and she hid it behind a mask of control and competence that most people probably never thought to question. And then there were the twins, Lily and Rose, the true reasons Sam found himself drawn to this job in ways that had nothing to do with the paycheck. He had first encountered them during his second day at the estate when his work order had taken him to the second floor to repair a faulty climate control unit in what the staff called the care room. It was a medical suite really equipped with hospital-grade monitoring equipment and specialized furniture designed for children with severe physical disabilities. Sam had entered expecting to find an empty room, but instead he had found two identical faces watching him from their positions on a soft wool rug. Lily and Rose Hartwell were 5 years old, blonde, like their late father. If the portraits in the hallway were accurate, with blue eyes that held an intensity that most people probably mistook for vacancy. They had been diagnosed with spastic quadriplegic cerebral palsy, the same condition that affected Emma. And according to the whispered conversations Sam had overheard among the nursing staff, the best specialists in the country had pronounced them nonverbal with severely limited cognitive capacity. But Sam knew better. He had spent 5 years learning to read Emma's face, to interpret the tiny movements that most people dismissed as involuntary, to understand that just because a body could not respond typically did not mean a mind was not working furiously behind the stillness. When he had looked into Lily and Rose's eyes that first day, he had seen the same thing he saw when he looked at his daughter: awareness, intelligence, and a desperate longing to be truly seen. He had knelt down on the rug beside them, ignoring the nurse's startled protest, and he had spoken to them the way he spoke to Emma, not in the exaggerated baby talk that so many people defaulted to, but in a normal conversational tone that assumed they understood every word. "Hey there, I'm Sam. I'm going to be fixing some things around here. You don't have to talk to me, but I want you to know I see you, both of you." And something had happened in that moment, something that Sam would later describe as a door opening a crack, letting in the faintest sliver of light. Both girls had turned their heads toward him, a coordinated movement that took obvious effort, and their eyes had tracked his face with an attention that contradicted every diagnosis in their medical files. Since then, Sam had found reasons to pass through the care room whenever his duties allowed. He would pause to talk to the girls, to sing them fragments of the lullabies he sang to Emma, to simply sit in their presence and let them know that someone in this vast, impersonal house saw them as human beings rather than medical cases to be managed. The nursing staff thought he was odd but harmless, and nobody had told him to stop. What Sam did not realize, could not have known, was that his presence had already begun to work subtle changes in the twins. The nurses had noticed that Lily and Rose were calmer when Sam was nearby, that their vital signs stabilized during his visits, that they seemed to track sounds more actively in the hours after he left. Notes had been made in medical logs, observations shared during shift changes, but nobody had thought to mention any of this to Victoria Hartwell, who received only summary reports focused on medications and physical therapy outcomes. This particular Monday morning began like any other, with Sam checking in at the service entrance and receiving his work orders from George Morrison, the head of household staff. George was 72 years old, a compact man with silver hair cropped close in a style that betrayed his 25 years of service in the United States Marine Corps. He had been with the Hartwell family for 15 years, hired by Jonathan Hartwell himself to bring military precision to the management of the estate, and he had stayed on after Jonathan's death out of loyalty to a man he had grown to love like a son. George ran the household with quiet efficiency, commanding the respect of the entire staff through competence rather than intimidation, and he had taken an interest in Sam from the new employee's first day. The older man had recognized something in Sam immediately: the bearing and the thousand-yard stare, and the particular way that veterans carried themselves even decades after their service ended. George had never served in combat himself, his career having been spent primarily in logistics and supply chain management, but he had trained enough young Marines to know the mark that war left on those who survived it. Sam found George in the staff office adjacent to the main kitchen, reviewing a clipboard of maintenance requests with reading glasses perched on his nose. The older man looked up as Sam entered and offered a nod of greeting. "Crawford, you're early." "Habit. Good habit." George set down the clipboard. "Got a full day for you. Light fixture in the East Wing library, running toilet in the ground floor guest bath, and Mrs. Hartwell wants someone to look at the heating in the care room. Girls' nurses say it's been running cold." Sam felt a familiar flutter of something that might have been anticipation at the mention of the care room, but he kept his expression neutral. "I can start with the care room. Get it done while the nurses are doing morning routines." George studied him for a moment, those sharp Marine eyes missing nothing. "You spend a lot of time up there." It was not quite a question, but Sam heard the inquiry beneath the words. "The work takes me there." "Does it?" Sam met the older man's gaze directly. "You have something to say, George?" The head of household staff was quiet for a long moment, then shook his head slowly. Nothing critical, just an observation. The nurses say the girls respond to you differently than they respond to most people. Kids know when someone's really paying attention. Most people don't really pay attention. I'm not most people. George's expression softened almost imperceptibly. No, I don't suppose you are. He handed Sam the clipboard with the work orders. Get to it then. And Crawford. Yeah, whatever you're doing up there, keep doing it. Those little girls deserve someone who sees them. Sam took the clipboard and headed for the main staircase, George's words echoing in his mind. Those little girls deserve someone who sees them. It was such a simple truth, and yet somehow the whole world seemed designed to make people invisible, to reduce human beings to categories and diagnoses and economic functions. Sam had learned the hard way that being truly seen was one of the rarest gifts one person could give another, and he had committed himself to giving that gift to Emma every single day. He had not planned to extend that commitment to the Hartwell twins, but life, he had learned, rarely cared about plans. The care room was on the second floor of the main house, at the end of a long hallway lined with oil paintings and antique furniture that probably cost more than Sam would earn in a decade. The door was partially open, and he could hear the soft murmur of the morning nurse speaking to someone on the phone about medication schedules. Sam knocked and pushed the door wider, stepping into a space that always struck him as deeply contradictory. The room was beautiful by any objective standard, with high ceilings and tall windows that looked out over the rose garden Victoria's late husband had planted. But it was also unmistakably a medical facility, with hospital beds disguised as elegant furniture monitoring equipment tucked discreetly behind decorative screens, and the faint antiseptic smell that no amount of air freshener could fully mask. Lily and Rose were on their usual spot on the plush wool rug positioned by the nurse for their morning stretching routine. They wore matching pink dresses with butterfly embroidery, their blonde hair brushed and tied with ribbons, looking for all the world like porcelain dolls arranged for display. But their eyes, those startlingly blue eyes, were alive and tracking as Sam entered. The nurse, a middle-aged woman named Patricia, looked up from her phone call and gestured for Sam to proceed with his work. Sam crossed to the far wall where the heating vent was located, but he made sure to pass close to the girls, pausing to crouch down to their level. His voice came out low and warm. "Good morning, ladies. How are we doing today?" Lily's fingers twitched against the rug, a movement so small that anyone else would have dismissed it as involuntary. But Sam recognized it as deliberate, a reaching toward him that her body could not fully execute. "I know," he murmured. "I see you. I'm going to be here for a bit, fixing the heat so you don't get cold. You just rest and listen to my terrible singing, okay?" He moved to the vent and began his inspection, quickly identifying a blocked filter that was restricting airflow. As he worked, he began to hum softly, then to sing under his breath, a lullaby that Helen had taught him years ago, one that he sang to Emma every night before bed. The melody was simple, almost childish, but there was something about the cadence that seemed to resonate with children who could not express themselves through conventional means. From behind him, he heard a sound that made him freeze mid-motion. It was not much, barely a whisper of voice, but it was unmistakably intentional. One of the girls was trying to mimic the melody. Sam turned slowly, his heart suddenly pounding against his ribs. Lily was looking directly at him, her mouth moving in tiny motions, attempting to form shapes that corresponded to the sound she was hearing. Rose beside her had her eyes fixed on her sister with an expression of intense concentration, as if willing Lily to succeed. The nurse Patricia had ended her phone call and was staring at the scene with undisguised shock. Sam moved back to the rug, lowering himself to sit cross-legged in front of the twins. He continued singing softly, watching Lily's efforts with the same patient attention he had cultivated over 5 years with Emma. The little girl's attempts were almost entirely unsuccessful, her damaged neural pathways struggling to translate intent into action, but there was no question that she was trying. Sam's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "That's it, sweetheart. You are doing amazing. Take your time." And then in a moment that would reshape the trajectory of multiple lives, Lily Hartwell produced a sound that was unmistakably a word. Duh. Sam's breath caught in his throat. Duh. D. Rose, as if encouraged by her sister's breakthrough, began to move her own lips, struggling against the same limitations, fighting with a determination that belied every medical prognosis ever written about her. D. D. Sam felt tears threatening at the corners of his eyes, but he blinked them back, maintaining the gentle, encouraging presence that he had learned was essential in moments like these. His voice remained calm even as his heart hammered. That's so good. You're both doing so good. I'm so proud of you. Neither he nor the girls were aware that Victoria Hartwell had arrived at the doorway drawn by some maternal instinct she did not fully understand, and was now standing frozen on the threshold watching her daughters speak for the first time in their lives. The word they were speaking was not mama. The Hermes bag slipped from Victoria's nerveless fingers and struck the marble floor of the hallway with a sound like a gunshot, and everything changed. Victoria could not move. Her body had become a statue rooted to the threshold of the care room by a paralysis that had nothing to do with her muscles and everything to do with the complete collapse of her understanding of the world. She was dimly aware of her own heartbeat thundering in her ears like distant artillery, and of the blood draining from her face, leaving her skin cold despite the warmth of the well-heated mansion. Her daughters were speaking. Lily and Rose, who had not produced a single intentional word in 5 years of life, were moving their lips and creating sounds that formed a recognizable English word. And that word was daddy, directed at the janitor who was supposed to be invisible, who was supposed to be fixing a heating vent, who was absolutely not supposed to be sitting on the floor of the care room like he belonged there. The janitor turned at the sound of her dropped bag, and Victoria saw his face go pale as he registered her presence. He rose quickly to his feet, his body language shifting from relaxed intimacy to rigid formality in a single motion, the transformation so complete that it might have been comical under different circumstances. Victoria heard herself speak the words emerging from some automated part of her brain that was still functioning even as the rest of her consciousness spun in freefall. What have you done? The question came out cold, almost mechanical, stripped of the emotional tempest raging beneath her surface composure. She had learned long ago to control her external presentation, to never let anyone see her bleeding, to maintain the mask of competence and authority that protected her from a world that would devour any sign of weakness. The janitor Crawford, according to his name tag, seemed to struggle for words. His mouth opened and closed once before he managed a response. Mrs. Hartwell, I can explain. But Victoria did not want explanations. She could not process explanations, not when her daughters were still making those sounds, still reaching their tiny arms toward this stranger with an eagerness they had never shown for anyone, least of all their own mother. She bent to retrieve her fallen bag, the motion mechanical, her body operating on autopilot while her mind reeled. When she straightened, she looked once more at Lily and Rose, at their animated faces and their trembling attempts to repeat the word that had shattered everything Victoria thought she knew about them. And then she turned and walked away, her Louboutin heels clicking against the marble in a rhythm that sounded like retreat. She found herself in Jonathan's study without any clear memory of navigating there, her feet having carried her to the only place in the house where she still felt his presence. The room was unchanged since his death 5 years ago, preserved like a museum exhibit by her explicit instruction to the household staff. His books still lined the shelves in his idiosyncratic organizational system. His favorite pen still sat in the brass cup on the desk. His reading glasses still rested on the stack of journals he had never finished reviewing. Victoria collapsed into the leather chair behind his desk, the same chair where Jonathan had sat to write his letters and review his business documents and compose the songs he used to sing to her when they were first married. And the world still seemed full of possibility. The tears came then, breaking through the dam of her control with a force that frightened her. She had not cried like this since the funeral had not allowed herself the luxury of complete emotional collapse, since the night she returned from identifying Jonathan's remains at the King County Medical Examiner's office. She had learned to portion out her grief in small, manageable doses, to acknowledge the pain without being consumed by it, to function as a mother and a CEO and a public figure, even as something essential inside her slowly died. But this was different. This was not grief for Jonathan, not exactly. This was something more complex, a tangled knot of emotions that she could not begin to unravel. Her daughters had spoken. The medical impossibility that she had secretly prayed for every night for 5 years had finally occurred. And it had happened not in response to the millions of dollars she had spent on specialists and therapies, not in response to her carefully researched treatment protocols and imported European techniques, but in response to a maintenance worker who earned less per year than she spent on a single charity gala. They had called him Daddy. Victoria's chest heaved with sobs. She could not control her body, purging emotions that had accumulated over 5 years of suppression. She cried for Lily and Rose and the connection she had never been able to form with them. She cried for Jonathan and the father he would have been if fate had not torn him from their lives. She cried for herself, for the mother she had tried to be and the mother she had failed to become, for the walls she had built around her heart and the terrible price those walls had extracted. When the storm finally passed, leaving her exhausted and hollowed out, Victoria found herself staring at the drawer of Jonathan's desk where she kept his final letter. She had read it so many times that she had memorized every word, could recite it in her sleep, had traced his handwriting with her fingertip until the paper had begun to show wear at the creases. She did not need to read it again. The relevant passage played in her mind like a recording. Lily and Rose don't need our money, Victoria. They don't need our status or our connections or our carefully curated world. They need love, patient, unconditional, persistent love. They need someone who will sit with them even when they can't respond, who will sing to them even when they seem not to hear, who will believe in them, even when every expert says there's nothing to believe in. She had read those words countless times and thought she understood them. She had hired the best caregivers money could buy, had approved every recommended therapy, had ensured her daughters received top-tier medical attention from the most respected specialists in the country. She had done everything a responsible mother should do. But she had not sat with them. She had not sung to them. She had not believed in them. Not in the deep and persistent way that Jonathan had meant. She had managed their care the way she managed the operations of Hartwell Industries, with efficiency, with resources, with delegation of tasks to qualified subordinates. And now a janitor, a man with no credentials and no pedigree, had accomplished in 3 weeks what her army of experts had failed to achieve in 5 years. Victoria's mind circled back to the scene in the care room, replaying it with the obsessive attention to detail that she brought to business negotiations and strategic planning. She analyzed Crawford's body language, his tone of voice, the way he had positioned himself in relation to the girls. There had been nothing inappropriate in his behavior, nothing that suggested ulterior motives or manipulation. He had simply been present, fully and completely present, in a way that Victoria realized she had never been with her own daughters. The realization was a blade sliding between her ribs, finding the soft places that her armor did not protect. She thought about the early months after Jonathan's death, when Lily and Rose were still infants, and the weight of her new responsibilities threatened to crush her. She had thrown herself into work as a coping mechanism, telling herself that providing financial security for her daughters was the best way to honor Jonathan's memory. She had expanded the company, closed deals, forged partnerships, transformed Hartwell Industries from a regional medical technology firm into a national powerhouse. Forbes had featured her on its cover. Businessweek had called her one of the most influential women in American industry. And while she was conquering the corporate world, her daughters were being raised by nurses and specialists and therapists who came and went according to shift schedules and contract terms. Victoria had told herself she was doing what was necessary, that someone had to maintain the family legacy that Jonathan would have wanted her to be strong. But sitting in his chair, surrounded by his books and his memories, she could no longer hide from the truth. She had used work as an escape, just as she had used it to escape her own childhood, in a modest house in Portland where her father drank too much and her mother worked double shifts at the cannery to keep the lights on. Work had been her salvation then. The straight-A student who won scholarships and clawed her way to Stanford Business School, where she met the handsome heir to a medical technology fortune and fell in love with a future that seemed to promise escape from everything her past represented. Jonathan had not cared about her background, had loved her fiercely despite his family's disapproval, had built a life with her that she thought would last forever. And when he died, work became her salvation again, the refuge where she could focus on problems that had solutions, challenges that could be overcome with sufficient effort and resources. But grief did not work like a business problem. Loss could not be managed with spreadsheets and strategic initiatives. And children could not be raised by quarterly reports. Victoria rose from the chair and moved to the window that overlooked the rose garden Jonathan had planted for her when they first moved into the estate. The bushes were beginning to shed their blooms, for the seasoned petals scattered across the grass like confetti from a celebration long past. She remembered how Jonathan used to cut roses for her every morning during the growing season, leaving them on her pillow so they would be the first thing she saw when she woke. No one had cut roses from that garden since his death. Victoria had never asked and the gardeners had never offered. She pressed her palm against the cold glass of the window and made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. She needed to talk to Samuel Crawford. She needed to understand what he had done and how he had done it. And she needed to face the possibility that everything she thought she knew about caring for her daughters had been catastrophically wrong. The conversation happened later that evening after Victoria had showered and changed and composed herself enough to function as the mistress of the Hartwell estate. She summoned Crawford to the small parlor adjacent to the main hall, a room she used for informal meetings with staff that required more privacy than could be found in the common areas. Crawford arrived promptly, still wearing his work uniform, his posture rigid with the tension of a man who expects to be fired. Victoria gestured for him to sit in the chair across from her, and he perched on the edge of the seat like a bird ready to take flight at the slightest provocation. Victoria studied him in silence for a long moment, taking in the details she had never bothered to notice in their previous brief encounters. He was younger than she had initially assumed, perhaps late 30s, with brown hair, graying at the temples, and a face that bore the marks of hard experience. His hands resting on his knees were calloused and scarred, the hands of a man accustomed to physical labor. But his eyes were what struck her most. They were watchful, intelligent, and held a depth of pain that she recognized because she saw something similar in her own mirror every morning. She heard herself speak the words emerging more gently than she had intended. "Tell me everything." Crawford's expression flickered with surprise, as if he had expected an inquisition rather than an invitation. He was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts, and when he spoke, his voice was low and careful. "I have a daughter, Emma. She's 5, same as Lily and Rose. Same diagnosis too, spastic quadriplegic cerebral palsy." Victoria felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of tension she had not realized she was holding. "I didn't know that." "No reason you would. I'm just the maintenance guy." "But you're not, are you not anymore? Not to my daughters." Crawford's jaw tightened. "Mrs. Hartwell, I never intended to overstep. I was just doing my job, and I happened to notice that Lily and Rose seemed forgotten. Not neglected, not mistreated, but forgotten. Like everyone had given up on them without realizing it." The words struck Victoria like physical blows, each one landing precisely on the bruises she had been nursing since Jonathan's death. She wanted to defend herself, to explain all the money she had spent, and the experts she had consulted, and the sleepless nights she had endured worrying about her daughter's futures. But the words would not come because she knew in the deepest part of herself that Crawford was right. Her voice emerged barely above a whisper. "I didn't give up on them." "No, ma'am, you gave up on yourself." Victoria's breath caught. No one had ever spoken to her like that, with such direct and unapologetic honesty. Her employees were too afraid of her to offer criticism. Her in-laws were too busy scheming to care about her emotional state. And her friends, the few she had maintained from her Stanford days, had drifted away as her grief and her work consumed more and more of her capacity for human connection. Crawford continued, his voice still gentle, despite the sharpness of his observation. "I recognize the look, Mrs. Hartwell. I've seen it in veterans who came home from war and couldn't figure out how to live in a world that didn't make sense anymore. I've seen it in widows and widowers who lost the person they built their whole life around. And I've seen it in my own mirror more times than I want to admit. You're a veteran." "Yes, ma'am, Army 101st Airborne, 2 tours in Iraq." That explained something Victoria realized. The bearing, the watchfulness, the particular kind of competence that came from having operated in environments where mistakes were measured in body counts. She had known many veterans through Jonathan's charity work, had seen the way combat changed men and women in ways that civilian life could never fully accommodate. And your wife Emma's mother, Crawford's expression shifted, a shadow passing across his features. "Helen, she died 3 years ago, cancer." "I'm sorry." "Thank you." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "Before she died, Helen made me promise something. She made me promise I would never give up on Emma. That no matter what the doctor said, no matter what the test showed, I would keep talking to our daughter like she could understand, keep singing to her like she could hear, keep believing in her like she could do anything." Victoria felt tears threatening again, and blinked them back fiercely. And has it worked with Emma? She says about 20 words now. Not much by normal standards. But 3 years ago, every specialist we saw said she would never speak at all. Crawford leaned forward slightly, his intensity increasing. Mrs. Hartwell, I'm not a doctor or a therapist. I don't have any degrees or certifications. I'm just a maintenance worker who happens to understand something about loving children who can't communicate the way the world expects them to. What do you understand? That they're watching, always listening, always absorbing. Even when their bodies can't respond, their minds are working, and they know the difference between people who see them as problems to be managed and people who see them as human beings to be loved. Victoria was silent for a long moment, processing Crawford's words. They aligned with everything Jonathan had written in his final letter, with the instincts she had suppressed in her rush to manage her daughter's conditions with the same efficiency she applied to business problems. The word they said, she finally managed. They called you Daddy. Crawford's expression tightened with what might have been embarrassment or might have been grief. I know, I'm sorry about that. I don't know why they don't apologize. Victoria cut him off, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. They chose that word for a reason. Maybe because she trailed off, unable to complete the thought. Crawford completed it for her. Maybe because I've been present with them in a way that felt fatherly. Sitting with them, talking to them, singing to them. The kinds of things a parent does. The kinds of things I should have been doing. It's not too late, Mrs. Hartwell. Victoria looked up sharply, meeting his eyes. How can you say that I've missed 5 years? 5 years of their lives and they don't even know me. They call a stranger Daddy, and I don't even know what sound they would make if they tried to say my name. Crawford stood, moving toward her with a deliberateness that might have felt threatening from another man, but from him felt only compassionate. He stopped a respectful distance away and spoke with quiet conviction. My wife used to say that it's never too late to start being the person you should have been. She said that to me when I was at my lowest point, when I had failed her in ways I'm still ashamed of. And she was right. The past is fixed, but the future is still being written. Victoria stared at him, this maintenance worker who spoke with the wisdom of someone who had passed through fire and emerged, if not unscathed, at least still standing. Will you help me? The question surprised her even as it left her lips. She had not intended to ask for help, had never been comfortable admitting that she needed anything from anyone. But the words were out now, and she found that she did not want to take them back. Crawford nodded slowly. I'll do what I can. But you should know, Mrs. Hartwell, that what your daughters need most isn't anything I can give them. What they need most is you. Victoria nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Crawford excused himself and left the parlor, and she sat alone in the gathering darkness, feeling for the first time in 5 years that something other than grief was possible. The following morning, Victoria did something she had not done since the week after Jonathan's funeral. She canceled all her meetings. Her assistant, a hyper-efficient young woman named Rachel, who managed Victoria's schedule with military precision, nearly choked on her coffee when Victoria called at 6:30 to issue the instructions. All of them, Mrs. Hartwell. You have the board briefing at 9 and the investor call at 2, and the reschedule everything. Tell them I have a family emergency. Is everything all right? Victoria paused, considering the question. I don't know yet, but I'm going to find out. She dressed in casual clothes for the first time in months, selecting items from the back of her closet that had been purchased for a life she no longer lived. Comfortable jeans, a soft sweater, shoes that were designed for walking rather than intimidating subordinates. She pulled her hair back in a simple ponytail, rather than the elaborate updo her stylist typically created, and she skipped the professional makeup in favor of basic moisturizer and a touch of lip balm. The woman who looked back at her from the mirror was almost unrecognizable, and Victoria realized with a start that she looked more like herself than she had in years. She went to the care room at 8 o'clock, early enough that the night shift nurse was still on duty and the morning routines had not yet begun. Lily and Rose were awake in their cribs, their eyes tracking the movement of light across the ceiling as dawn brightened the windows. Victoria approached them slowly, afraid of startling them, despite knowing intellectually that her presence was unlikely to register as threatening. She looked down at her daughters, really looked at them for the first time since she could remember. They were beautiful. She had always known that in an abstract way, had noted it with the same detached appreciation she brought to evaluating the aesthetic qualities of art or architecture. But now she saw them differently, not as medical cases or logistical challenges or reminders of everything she had lost, but as human beings. Small, vulnerable fighting battles she could barely comprehend, with bodies that refused to cooperate with their brilliant minds. Victoria lowered the side of Lily's crib and reached in, lifting her daughter with a gentleness she had almost forgotten she possessed. The little girl was lighter than expected, her body thin, despite the careful nutrition the medical team provided, and she fit against Victoria's chest like she had been designed to nestle there. Her voice came out rough with emotion. "Good morning, sweetheart. It's Mommy. I know I haven't been here enough. I know you don't know me the way you should, but I'm going to change that starting right now." Lily's eyes found her mother's face, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, almost imperceptibly, Lily's hand twitched against Victoria's arm, the ghost of a reaching motion. Victoria felt tears streaming down her cheeks and did nothing to stop them. She carried Lily to the rocking chair by the window and sat down, settling her daughter in her lap, and she began to talk. She talked about Jonathan, about how much he had loved the twins, about the songs he used to sing when they were still in the womb. She talked about her own childhood, about growing up poor in Portland and dreaming of a life that seemed impossibly distant. She talked about her fears and her failures and her desperate hope that somehow, despite everything, she could still become the mother her daughters deserved. She did not know how much Lily understood. She did not know if her words were penetrating the barriers that separated her daughter's mind from the outside world. But she talked anyway because Samuel Crawford had been right. What mattered was not the response, but the presence, not the outcome, but the effort. When she finished with Lily, she lifted Rose from her crib and repeated the process, holding her second daughter close and pouring out the same confession of love and regret and determination. Rose watched her with those intense blue eyes, and Victoria could have sworn she saw something there that looked like recognition. The morning shift nurse, a kind woman named Janet, who had been with the family for 2 years, stood in the doorway watching with tears in her own eyes. She had never seen Mrs. Hartwell like this, had never witnessed the Ice Queen of Bellevue Hills showing genuine emotion with her children. When Victoria finally looked up and noticed Janet watching, she did not feel embarrassed or exposed. She felt for the first time in years like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She spoke with quiet determination. "Janet, I want you to tell me everything. Everything about their daily routines, their preferences, their responses to different stimuli. I want to learn how to care for them properly." Janet nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "And please ask Mr. Crawford to join me when he arrives. I want to understand exactly what he's been doing with my daughters so I can learn to do it too." The transformation of Victoria Hartwell had begun, and the entire household would soon feel its effects. George Morrison observed the changes from his vantage point as head of household staff, watching with the experienced eye of a man who had managed complex operations in wartime and peacetime alike. He saw Victoria emerging from the care room with red-rimmed eyes and a softness in her expression that he had not witnessed since before Jonathan's death. He saw Samuel Crawford spending longer hours on the second floor, his maintenance duties apparently expanded to include unspecified therapeutic activities with the twins. And he saw the ripple effects spreading through the estate staff, a loosening of tension that came from serving a mistress who was finally present rather than merely powerful. George had known Jonathan Hartwell for nearly 2 decades, had watched him grow from a privileged but good-hearted young man into a husband and father whose love for his family was the bedrock of his existence. He had grieved Jonathan's death with the quiet intensity of a man trained to process loss without letting it compromise his function, but he had never stopped missing the warmth that Jonathan had brought to the cold grandeur of the Hartwell estate. Now, watching Victoria begin to reclaim some of that warmth, George felt something he had almost forgotten was possible hope. He waited 3 days before approaching Samuel Crawford, directly choosing a moment when the younger man was taking a coffee break in the staff kitchen, the quiet space deserted in the mid-afternoon lull between lunch cleanup and dinner preparation. George poured himself a cup from the ever-present carafe and settled into the chair across from Crawford. The younger man looked up from his own coffee, his expression guarded but not hostile. George began without preamble. "You served in Iraq." Crawford's eyes narrowed slightly. "How did you know?" "I was a Marine for 25 years. I know how combat veterans carry themselves, and I know the look in their eyes. George paused, sipping his coffee. 101st Airborne. Yes, sir. Don't sir me, I was supply chain, never saw combat. You outrank me in everything that matters. Crawford's guard lowered fractionally. I appreciate that, but rank doesn't mean much to me anymore. It shouldn't. The things that matter don't come with chevrons attached. George set down his cup and leaned forward slightly. I want you to know something, Crawford. What you're doing with those little girls, it's making a difference. Not just to them, but to this whole household. I'm just doing what I did with my own daughter. I know. Mrs. Hartwell told me about Emma, and I know about your wife. George's voice softened. I lost my son in Iraq, Fallujah 2004. Marine Corps like his old man. Crawford's expression shifted the shared grief of those who had lost, creating an instant connection that transcended the differences in their backgrounds and positions. His voice came low and rough. I'm sorry. Thank you. His name was Michael. He was 23 years old and he believed in something enough to die for it. I've spent 18 years trying to figure out if that belief was justified. Did you find an answer? No, but I found something else. I found that asking the question is more important than finding the answer. George leaned back in his chair. You remind me of Michael in some ways. Not physically, but something in the core of you. The same willingness to show up when things are hard, to stay present when running would be easier. Crawford looked down at his coffee cup, seeming uncomfortable with the praise. I ran once, when it counted most. I failed my wife when she was dying because I couldn't handle watching her go. I've been trying to make up for that ever since. Making up for failures is a fool's errand. The past doesn't change no matter how hard we wish it would, but building something good from the wreckage that's within our power. George paused, considering his next words carefully. Crawford, there's something you should know about this family, about the dangers lurking beneath the surface. Crawford looked up sharply, his military instincts engaging. What kind of dangers? Richard Hartwell, the old man, he's never accepted Victoria running the company. He thinks she's an outsider, a gold digger who tricked his son into marriage and now controls his legacy by accident of timing. He's been looking for a way to remove her since the day Jonathan died. Remove her how? Any way he can. Business maneuvers, legal challenges, manipulation of the board. And now with what's happening with the twins. George shook his head. If Richard finds out that Victoria's authority over her own daughters could be challenged, he'll use it. He'll use anything. Crawford's jaw tightened. What does Victoria's relationship with her daughters have to do with Richard's business schemes? Everything. The twins are Jonathan's heirs. If something happened to Victoria, if she was found unfit to be their guardian, the court would appoint someone else. Someone like Richard, who would control their inheritance until they came of age. George paused. And if the twins were declared permanently incapacitated, unable to ever manage their own affairs, Richard could potentially petition to have himself named conservator of their trust. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars. Jesus Christ. Indeed. So be careful, Crawford. What you're doing with Lily and Rose is a miracle in progress. But there are people who would prefer that miracle never happen because healthy heirs are harder to control than invalids. Crawford sat in silence for a long moment, processing the implications of what George had revealed. When he spoke, his voice carried the cold determination of a soldier facing a clearly defined enemy. Thanks for the warning, George. I'll be careful. See that you are. And Crawford, one more thing. Yeah. Welcome to the family, such as it is. The two men sat together in comfortable silence, finishing their coffee, as the afternoon light slanted through the kitchen windows, two veterans of different wars united by their commitment to protect something precious from forces that would see it destroyed. The first real test of that commitment came 3 weeks later when Richard Hartwell made his move. Victoria was in her home office reviewing quarterly reports with half her attention, while the other half remained fixed on the baby monitor she had moved from the nursery to her desk. The device showed Lily and Rose in the care room, Samuel Crawford reading to them from a picture book, while they watched with unusual alertness. In the 3 weeks since Victoria had begun her transformation, the twins had continued to progress at a rate that astonished their medical team. They were now reliably producing several recognizable words, had developed clear preferences for certain caregivers and activities, and showed increasing physical responsiveness to stimulation. The head neurologist at Seattle Children's Medical Center had visited twice to evaluate them and had declared himself cautiously optimistic about their developmental trajectory. But the progress had also attracted attention that Victoria would have preferred to avoid. The intercom on her desk buzzed and her assistant's voice came through. "Mrs. Hartwell, your father-in-law is here. He's insisting on seeing you immediately." Victoria's stomach clenched, the familiar dread that Richard's presence always evoked rising like bile in her throat. She had managed to avoid him for nearly a month, declining dinner invitations and delegating board interactions to her subordinates. But she could not avoid him forever. "Send him in." The door opened moments later, and Richard Hartwell swept into the room with the imperious energy of a man accustomed to commanding any space he entered. At 70, he was still physically imposing, tall and broad-shouldered, with silver hair swept back from a face that time had hardened into something approaching sculpture. His eyes were pale gray, the color of winter sky, and they missed nothing. Behind him came Thomas Burke, the family attorney, whose presence immediately elevated Victoria's concern from uncomfortable to alarming. Burke only appeared when legal matters were at stake, and legal matters with Richard were never simple. Richard did not wait for an invitation to sit. He settled into the chair across from Victoria's desk as if he owned it, which in a sense he believed he did. Burke remained standing, his thin frame arranged beside the window, like a vulture waiting for something to die. Richard's voice carried the precise enunciation of expensive education and lifelong privilege. "Victoria, you've been avoiding me." "I've been busy, Richard, running the company that you entrusted to me." Entrusted is a generous word for what happened. Jonathan died and you were the only Hartwell left standing. Circumstance, not trust, put you in that chair. Victoria felt the familiar anger rising but forced herself to remain calm. Richard's provocations were calculated to make her react emotionally, to give him ammunition for whatever scheme he was currently executing. She would not give him the satisfaction. "Is there a purpose to this visit, Richard? Or did you just come to remind me of your contempt?" Richard smiled, the expression reaching nowhere near his eyes. "There is a purpose. Thomas, if you would." Burke stepped forward and placed a folder on Victoria's vacuum. His voice was smooth as oil on water. "Mrs. Hartwell, this is a formal notification that Richard and Catherine Hartwell intend to petition the court for guardianship of your daughters, Lily and Rose." The words hit Victoria like a physical blow, but she forced her expression to remain neutral. "On what grounds parental unfitness?" Burke replied, his tone suggesting that he was merely reciting established facts rather than making accusations. "Specifically emotional neglect leading to developmental delay, and more recently inappropriate delegation of care to unqualified individuals." Victoria's voice went cold. "You'll have to be more specific." Richard leaned forward, clearly enjoying himself. "We have documentation from independent medical experts stating that Lily and Rose's developmental problems could have been significantly mitigated with proper parental attention during their early years. We have testimony from staff members describing your chronic absence from their lives. And we have evidence that you've recently been allowing an untrained maintenance worker to perform therapeutic activities with your daughters, activities for which he has no qualification or certification. Samuel Crawford has been helping my daughters communicate, something no certified therapist has achieved in 5 years. Ah, yes, the miracle worker." Richard's tone dripped with contempt. "The janitor who sings to the crippled children and somehow makes them talk. It's a touching story, Victoria. The press will love it when they find out. Single mother too busy with her career to care for her disabled children, so she hands them off to the help." Victoria felt her hands trembling beneath the desk but kept her voice steady. "You wouldn't dare go to the press. The scandal would damage the company." "The scandal would damage you. The company would survive, especially under new management." Richard stood smoothing his jacket. "You have 30 days to respond to the petition. I suggest you use that time to consider your options. If you cooperate, if you step down from the CEO position and allow me to resume control of Hartwell Industries, this can all go away quietly. The children can remain in your care under appropriate supervision. No one needs to know about your failures as a mother." "And if I refuse?" Richard's smile widened. "Then we'll see you in court. And Thomas will present evidence that will make the judge very concerned about your fitness to raise vulnerable children." Evidence including the interesting fact that your maintenance worker has a history of mental health issues. PTSD, I believe it's called. Very unstable condition. Not the sort of person who should be around children. Wouldn't you agree? Victoria rose to her feet, her anger finally breaking through her control. Get out of my house. Richard seemed unperturbed by her fury. 30 days, Victoria. Think about what you're willing to lose. He turned and walked toward the door, Burke trailing behind him like a loyal shadow. At the threshold, Richard paused and looked back. Jonathan would be so disappointed in what you've become. But then he always did have a weakness for broken things. The door closed behind them, and Victoria collapsed back into her chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. She sat in the silence of her office, listening to her own ragged breathing, trying to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. Richard was going to take her children. He was going to use her failures, her grief, her desperate attempt to finally become the mother she should have been, and he was going to twist them into weapons against her. And he was going to drag Samuel Crawford into it, exposing the man's private struggles to public scrutiny, destroying his reputation in the process. For a long moment, Victoria allowed herself to feel the full weight of despair. Richard had resources, connections, and a ruthlessness that she had always feared but never fully understood. He had been building this case for years, waiting for the right moment to strike. And now that moment had arrived. But despair was a luxury she could not afford. She had learned that lesson in the months after Jonathan's death, when the company nearly collapsed under the weight of investor panic and board uncertainty. She had fought her way back from the brink then, and she would fight again now. Victoria picked up her phone and dialed a number she had not used in 3 years, the number of a law firm that had no connection to the Hartwell family, a firm that specialized in family law cases that seemed unwinnable. A woman's voice answered on the third ring. Sarah Mitchell, how can I help you? Sarah, it's Victoria Hartwell. I need your help. What's happening? My father-in-law is trying to take my children, and I'm going to stop him, whatever it costs. The days that followed were a blur of legal consultations, document reviews, and strategic planning. Sarah Mitchell turned out to be everything Victoria needed, sharp, aggressive, and completely unintimidated by the Hartwell name. She had built her reputation on cases exactly like this one, family disputes where wealth and power were used as weapons against those with fewer resources. Sarah's first act was to conduct a thorough review of the evidence Richard claimed to have. Her assessment was sobering, but not hopeless. They have a case, Sarah admitted during their second meeting, spreading documents across Victoria's dining table. The medical reports about developmental delays are real, and they can argue that more parental involvement might have led to better outcomes. The testimony from staff members is problematic, mainly complaints about your absence that have been on file with the family office for years. Those complaints were never brought to my attention. No, because the family office reports to Richard's people. He's been building this case for longer than you realized. Sarah paused, her expression hardening. But here's the thing, Victoria. They're attacking your past behavior. What matters now is your present and future behavior. If we can demonstrate that you've changed, that you're now providing the kind of care that Lily and Rose need, we can undercut their entire argument. What about Samuel Crawford? They're going to use his PTSD against him. That's trickier. Mental health stigma is real, and some judges are more susceptible to it than others. But PTSD is not a disqualifying condition for childcare work. Millions of veterans manage their symptoms and live productive lives. If we can get testimony from his doctors, from the VA showing that he's been managing his condition responsibly, that should help. Victoria nodded slowly. There's something else you should know, something Richard doesn't realize. What's that? My daughters are getting better, really better. 3 weeks ago, they couldn't say a single word. Now they're producing multiple words, responding to their environment, showing development that their doctors say exceeds all expectations. Victoria leaned forward. Samuel Crawford did that, not the expensive specialist, not the experimental therapies, him. And if we can get the medical team to testify about the progress they've witnessed, we can prove that whatever he's doing is working. Sarah's expression shifted from professional skepticism to genuine interest. That could change everything. If we can demonstrate that Crawford's methods, whatever they are actually helping the children, it becomes much harder for Richard to argue that your judgment in employing him is evidence of unfitness. He's not just an employee anymore, Victoria said quietly. He's become part of our family. I'm going to ask him to move into the estate with his daughter. Formally. Sarah's eyebrows rose. That's a significant step. Are you sure it's wise during an active custody dispute? Richard is going to argue that I neglected my daughters. I'm going to show that I've created a home where they're finally thriving. That includes Samuel Crawford and his daughter Emma, who has the same condition as Lily and Rose. The four of them together, they have a connection that I can't explain and don't fully understand. But it's real and it's helping all of them. Sarah studied Victoria for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, if you're committed to this course, we should formalize everything properly. Employment contracts, residential agreements, clear documentation of roles and responsibilities. We need to be able to show the court that this is a thoughtful, structured arrangement, not some impulsive reaction to the custody challenge. I'll talk to Crawford tonight. The conversation with Samuel Crawford took place in the garden as the sun set behind the Olympic Mountains and painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. Victoria found him at the stone bench beside the koi pond, the same spot where they had talked weeks earlier about his wife and his daughter and the strange path that had brought him into her family's life. He stood when he saw her approaching the deference of an employee still deeply ingrained despite everything that had changed between them. Victoria gestured for him to sit back down and settled onto the bench beside him, close enough that she could speak quietly and be heard over the gentle splash of the fountain. She told him everything. Richard's threats, the custody petition, the attack on Crawford's mental health history. She held nothing back because he deserved to know what he was facing and to make his own choice about whether to remain involved. When she finished, Crawford was silent for a long moment. His face was unreadable in the fading light, the shadows playing across features that seemed carved from something harder than flesh. When he spoke, his voice carried a weariness that went bone deep. I knew there would be consequences. Nothing good ever comes without a price. You don't have to stay. I would understand if you wanted to walk away from this. Protect yourself and Emma from the ugliness that's coming. Crawford shook his head slowly. Mrs. Hartwell, I spent years running from hard things. I ran from my wife when she was dying, ran from my daughter when her diagnosis scared me, ran from everything that asked me to be stronger than I felt. And all that running did was delay the pain and add regret to the pile. He turned to look at her directly, his eyes catching the last light of the setting sun. Lily and Rose are starting to find their voices. For the first time in their lives, someone is hearing them. I'm not going to abandon them because their grandfather wants to use me as a pawn in some family power struggle. Victoria felt tears threatening and blinked them back. Richard will drag your personal history into public view. Your military service, your PTSD, everything you've kept private. Let him. I'm not ashamed of my service or my struggles. I did what my country asked me to do, and I came home with wounds that don't show. That doesn't make me dangerous or unfit. That makes me human. Victoria reached out and touched his arm, a gesture of connection that would have been unthinkable a month ago. I want to ask you something. You can say no, and I'll understand. Ask. I want you and Emma to move into the estate, formally as residents rather than just employee and visitor. The West Wing has private quarters that would give you space and independence. You would still work here, still help with Lily and Rose, but you would do it as part of our household rather than as temporary staff. Crawford's expression shifted surprise and something that might have been hope flickering across his features. You're offering us a home. I'm offering more than that. I'm offering us a chance to become something like a family. I don't know what shape that takes or where it leads, but I know that my daughters are better when you're around, and I've seen how Emma lights up when she's with Lily and Rose. We all need each other, Crawford. I'm just finally brave enough to admit it. Crawford was quiet for a long time, his gaze fixed on the koi circling in the darkening pond. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. Helen used to say that family isn't about blood. It's about who shows up when the night gets dark. She would have liked you, Mrs. Hartwell. She would have seen the same thing I see someone fighting to become better than her past allowed her to be. Is that a yes? Crawford turned to face her, and in the dim light, she could see the glint of moisture in his eyes. It's a yes, for Emma's sake, and for Lily and Rose, and honestly for myself. I've been alone for a long time. It would be good to be part of something bigger again. Victoria nodded, not trusting her voice. They sat together in the gathering darkness, two people whose lives had been shaped by loss, now finding the courage to build something new from the wreckage. The logistics of moving Samuel and Emma Crawford into the Hartwell estate were handled with the same efficiency that Victoria brought to corporate mergers. Sarah Mitchell drew up the residential agreement defining Crawford's role as both maintenance supervisor and therapeutic caregiver for the twins. A medical consulting firm reviewed the arrangement and provided written documentation that Crawford's approach to working with the children was consistent with current best practices in early intervention for cerebral palsy patients. The West Wing quarters were prepared with care, the 3 bedrooms and private living area furnished to accommodate Emma's accessibility needs while providing the kind of comfortable home environment that Crawford and his daughter had never been able to afford on his maintenance worker salary. Victoria personally oversaw the installation of the specialized equipment. Emma required the same level of medical support that Lily and Rose received. Emma Crawford arrived at the estate on a gray Saturday morning, her wheelchair pushed by her father up the ramp that had been installed at the West Wing entrance. She was a beautiful child with her father's brown hair and her late mother's warm eyes, her face carrying an alertness that contradicted every assessment of limited cognitive function. She looked around at the grand architecture with an expression of wonder that made Victoria's heart ache with recognition. Victoria knelt beside the wheelchair, putting herself at Emma's eye level. "Welcome home, Emma. I'm Victoria. I have 2 daughters about your age, and they have been very excited to meet you." Emma's eyes found Victoria's face and held there assessing this strange woman who was offering such an extraordinary thing. Then slowly, deliberately, her hand moved toward Victoria's, the motion clearly intentional, despite its trembling imprecision. Victoria took the small hand in her own, feeling the warmth of it, the life pulsing through this child whom the world had written off. She looked up at Crawford and saw tears streaming down his weathered face, the sight of his daughter being accepted with such genuine warmth overwhelming the walls he usually kept in place. This was the moment, Victoria realized later, when everything truly changed. Not the conversations about legal strategy or the documents defining living arrangements. This moment when 3 damaged people and 4 struggling children began to recognize themselves as something more than the sum of their individual brokenness. The first meeting between Emma and the twins took place that afternoon in the care room with Victoria Crawford and the nursing staff watching from the edges of the space. Emma's wheelchair was positioned on the soft rug where Lily and Rose lay in their supported positions, the 3 children forming a loose circle. For several long minutes, nothing happened. The children simply looked at each other, their eyes moving from face to face with an intensity that seemed almost otherworldly. Crawford had warned Victoria that this might happen, that children like theirs often took time to process new situations and people, that rushing the interaction would only create anxiety. Then Lily moved. It was a small movement, just a turning of her head and a reaching of her hand, but it was unmistakably directed at Emma. And from Lily's throat came a sound that made Victoria's heart stop. "Ma." Rose followed moments later, her own voice joining her sister's "Ma." Emma's face transformed with joy, a smile breaking across her features that was so pure and unguarded that Victoria felt tears streaming down her own cheeks. And then Emma spoke, her voice clearer than either of the twins, but still marked by the same neurological challenges. "Li, ro, si, friends." Crawford knelt beside his daughter's wheelchair, his hand on her shoulder. His face wet with tears, he made no attempt to hide. The nursing staff stood frozen, witnessing something that no textbook had prepared them for 3 children whom the medical establishment had declared incapable of meaningful communication, speaking each other's names and declaring friendship. Victoria crossed the room and lowered herself to the rug beside her daughters, gathering them into her arms as best she could without disturbing their therapeutic positioning. She looked at Crawford and Emma, and she spoke the words that had been building in her chest since the moment she decided to fight for her family. "We're going to be okay. All of us. Whatever Richard throws at us, whatever the world says about who we are and what we're capable of, we're going to prove them wrong. Together." Crawford nodded, his expression hardening into the determination that Victoria was learning to recognize as his combat face, the look of a man who had survived impossible odds and was prepared to do so again. Together. Outside the windows of the care room, the autumn rain began to fall, tapping against the glass in a rhythm that sounded almost like applause. Inside it, a new family was taking shape, forged not by blood, but by love, by struggle, by the stubborn refusal to accept the limitations that others tried to impose. The battle for the Hartwell children was just beginning, but for the first time since Jonathan's death, Victoria felt ready to fight. George Morrison watched these developments unfold with the satisfaction of a general seeing his troops finally taking the field. He had known from the first week that Samuel Crawford was something special, had recognized the quality of character that military service could reveal, but never create. And he had hoped, in the quiet way of old men who have seen too much to believe in miracles, but still yearn for them, that Crawford's presence might somehow crack the ice that had formed around Victoria Hartwell's heart. Now seeing the household transformed, seeing Victoria emerge from her grief like a butterfly from a chrysalis, George allowed himself to feel something he had almost forgotten was possible: optimism about the future. He sought out Crawford one evening in the West Wing, finding the younger man in Emma's bedroom, adjusting the medical equipment that monitored her vital signs through the night. Emma was already asleep, her breathing steady and peaceful, her face relaxed in the way that children's faces look when they are surrounded by safety and love. George knocked softly on the doorframe, and Crawford looked up from his task. Without words, Crawford followed George into the small living area of the West Wing quarters, where they could speak without disturbing Emma's rest. George settled into an armchair, his old bones protesting the day's accumulated efforts. He looked at Crawford with the directness that came from decades of dealing with Marines who had no patience for circumlocution. "You've done something remarkable here, Crawford. In just a few weeks, you've changed the entire trajectory of this family." Crawford shook his head, uncomfortable as always with praise. "I haven't done anything special. I just treated those children like human beings instead of medical cases. And in doing so, you reminded their mother how to do the same. That's not nothing, son. That's everything." Crawford was quiet for a moment, then asked the question that had clearly been weighing on him. "George, why did Richard Hartwell turn out the way he did? Jonathan was nothing like him from what I've heard. How does a father and son end up so different?" George sighed, the weight of history settling on his shoulders. "Richard grew up in a different time, a different world. His father was a ruthless man, the kind who built empires on the backs of workers he viewed as expendable. Richard learned early that money was the only measure that mattered, that power was the only protection against a hostile world. And Jonathan was a miracle, born with all of Richard's privileges, but none of his cruelty. His mother, Elizabeth. God rest her soul, she made sure of that. She filled that boy with love and compassion from the day he was born, and Richard could never quite beat it out of him, despite his best efforts." Crawford's expression darkened. "Richard beat his son, not physically, not often anyway, but there are other kinds of violence that don't leave visible marks. Constant criticism, impossible expectations, the withholding of approval that a child craves from his father. Richard wanted to create a copy of himself, and when Jonathan refused to become that copy, Richard viewed it as betrayal. And Victoria, how does she fit into this? Victoria was the final betrayal in Richard's eyes. Jonathan chose to marry a woman from a working-class background, a woman who had earned her success rather than inheriting it. Richard fought that marriage with everything he had threatened to cut Jonathan off, tried to have Victoria investigated by private detectives. Nothing worked. Jonathan loved her, and he was stubborn enough to defy his father for that love. Crawford absorbed this information, his expression thoughtful. So, when Jonathan died, Richard saw his chance. His son was gone, but the empire remained. If he could just get rid of Victoria, he could resume control. The twins were a complication, but Richard's lawyers assured him that disabled heirs could be managed through conservatorships and trusts. Everything was proceeding according to plan, until the twins started talking. George nodded. "Until you showed up and reminded everyone that those little girls are human beings with potential, not just entries on a balance sheet. Now Richard's whole scheme is in jeopardy. If Lily and Rose continue to improve, if they eventually become capable of expressing their own wishes about their inheritance, Richard's chances of controlling the Hartwell fortune diminish significantly. So he's trying to stop their progress by removing Victoria and me. That's my assessment, yes. Remove Victoria, discredit you and the twins, go back to being managed by professionals who have been instructed not to expect too much from them." Crawford's hands clenched into fists, a soldier's instinct to respond to threat with force. But his voice when he spoke was controlled. "How do we stop him?" George smiled, the expression carrying a warmth that softened his weathered features. We keep doing what we're doing. We help those children flourish. We support Victoria in her transformation. We document everything, every milestone, every word, every sign of progress. And when Richard brings his case to court, we show the judge that his entire argument is based on a version of reality that no longer exists. That's simple. Simple yes, easy no. Richard has resources and connections that most people can only dream of. He'll fight dirty attack character, manipulate the narrative, but he doesn't understand something fundamental about this situation. What's that? George leaned forward, his eyes bright with conviction. He doesn't understand that you can't beat love with money. You can't litigate away the poem that's forming between those children. And you can't convince a judge that a family is broken when the evidence of healing is right there in front of everyone's eyes. Crawford nodded slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. Helen used to say something similar. She said that love was the only force in the universe that grew stronger when you gave it away. Smart woman, your wife. The smartest person I ever knew. George rose from his chair, his joints protesting the movement. He placed a hand on Crawford's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity between veterans of different wars. Get some rest, son. Tomorrow's going to be a long day, and the days after that are going to be longer still. Crawford looked up at the older man. George, why are you helping us? You've been with the Hartwell family for 15 years. Richard is technically your employer. Why risk everything to side with the Victoria and me? George was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. When Jonathan hired me, he told me something I've never forgotten. He said, George, I don't need someone to protect the Hartwell fortune. I need someone to protect the Hartwell family. And the family isn't the money or the properties or the business. The family is the people we love and the people who love us back. His voice thickened with emotion that he did not try to hide. Jonathan was the son I lost and the friend I needed. I couldn't save him from that airplane, but I can save his wife and his daughters from his father. That's what he would have wanted. That's what I'm going to do. He turned and walked toward the door, pausing at the threshold to look back. Welcome to the family, Crawford, such as it is. The door closed behind him, leaving Crawford alone with his sleeping daughter and his racing thoughts. Outside the windows of the West Wing, the rain had stopped, and the first stars were appearing in the clearing sky. Somewhere in the main house, Victoria was putting her daughters to bed, singing them the lullabies that Jonathan had written and that Crawford had discovered in that fateful notebook. The battle lines were drawn, the forces arrayed, and in the spaces between the coming conflict, a family was taking shape, finding its voice, learning to love in the face of everything that sought to tear it apart. The first month of the new arrangement was a period of intensive bonding and careful documentation. Victoria restructured her work schedule to spend mornings and evenings with the children, delegating more of her daily responsibilities to her executive team. She hired a professional videographer to record the twins' therapy sessions and development milestones, creating an irrefutable visual record of their progress. Lily and Rose continued to exceed all expectations. Their vocabulary expanded weekly, moving from single words to simple phrases to rudimentary sentences that left their medical teams scrambling to update their developmental assessments. They learned to respond to questions with yes or no answers, to express preferences about food and activities, to engage in simple conversations that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. Emma Crawford flourished in her new environment, benefiting from the same therapeutic approaches that were helping the twins while also serving as a kind of peer model that inspired Lily and Rose to push their own limits. The three girls developed their own methods of communication, a combination of words and gestures and expressions that the adults around them gradually learned to interpret. And through it all, Victoria transformed. The woman who had once hidden behind boardroom negotiations and quarterly reports now spent hours on the floor of the care room singing songs and reading stories, and simply being present in a way she had never allowed herself to be before. She was awkward at first, her muscle memory attuned to spreadsheets rather than lullabies, but she improved with the same determination she had brought to building the Hartwell empire. Crawford watched these changes with a mixture of pride and something else, something he was reluctant to name. He saw Victoria's growth, her courage, her gradual emergence from the shell of grief that had entombed her for 5 years. He saw her tenderness with the children, her gratitude toward him, her increasing comfort in his presence. And he saw with the clarity that comes from having loved deeply and lost everything that his feelings for Victoria Hartwell were becoming complicated in ways that could cause tremendous harm if not carefully managed. He did not act on these feelings. He was too disciplined for that, too aware of the fragility of the situation, too committed to protecting what they were building to risk it all on romantic impulses. But he could not stop himself from noticing the way her eyes lit up when she entered the care room, the way her laugh sounded when Emma did something unexpectedly funny, the way her hands sometimes brushed his arm when they discussed the children's progress. George noticed, of course. The old Marine missed nothing, but he said nothing, allowing the situation to develop according to its own organic rhythm. Some things could not be forced, and some things could not be prevented. The wisest course was simply to watch and wait. The day before Richard's deadline for Victoria's response to his ultimatum arrived with the gray weight of impending storm. Victoria had made her decision weeks ago, but she had delayed communicating it until the last possible moment, using the time to strengthen her legal position and document every aspect of the children's improvement. She summoned Richard to her office, reversing their usual dynamic by making him come to her, rather than accepting his invitation to meet on his territory. When he arrived, accompanied as always by Thomas Burke, she was sitting behind Jonathan's desk, wearing a suit that had been a gift from her late husband, and holding a folder containing enough documentation to sink Richard's case. Richard surveyed the room with the calculating eyes of a man assessing enemy fortifications. "You wanted to see me, Victoria." "Sit down, Richard." "I prefer to stand." "Suit yourself." Victoria opened the folder and began removing documents, arranging them in neat stacks on the desk. "I've given careful consideration to your proposal. The offer to step down as CEO in exchange for you withdrawing your custody petition. And I decline." Richard's expression did not change, but something flickered in his pale eyes. "That's unfortunate. You understand what this means. I understand that you're going to take me to court. I understand that you're going to try to paint me as an unfit mother and Samuel Crawford as a dangerous lunatic. I understand that you're willing to hurt your own grandchildren to get what you want." Victoria stood leaning forward with her palms flat on the desk. "What I don't understand, Richard, is how a man can look at two little girls who are finally finding their voices and decide that the appropriate response is to silence them." Richard's lip curled. "Spare me the theatrics, Victoria. This isn't about the children. It's about control of the Hartwell legacy. For you, perhaps. For me, it's about protecting my daughters from a grandfather who views them as inconvenient obstacles to his ambitions. They're vegetables, Victoria. All the progress you claim they've made, it's temporary. False hope generated by a mentally unstable veteran who has filled your head with delusions." Victoria's voice went cold. "My daughters spoke their first words a month ago. They can now communicate in complete sentences. They recognize faces, express preferences, and engage with their environment in ways that every specialist said was impossible. That is not a delusion. That is documented medical fact." She pushed the folder across the desk toward Richard. "This contains sworn statements from Dr. William Foster at Johns Hopkins, Dr. Sarah Martinez at Seattle Children's Medical Center, and 3 independent pediatric neurologists who have evaluated Lily and Rose in the past 4 weeks. All of them confirm significant developmental progress. All of them attribute that progress to the therapeutic approach developed by Samuel Crawford. And all of them are prepared to testify in court." Richard did not reach for the folder. His face had gone rigid, the mask of confidence cracking around the edges. "Medical opinions can be bought. These weren't. I invited specialists with no prior connection to the Hartwell family, paid them standard consultation rates, and gave them complete access to my daughter's records and to the girls themselves. Their conclusions are independent and unimpeachable." Thomas Burke stepped forward, his oily voice attempting to restore control of the situation. "Mrs. Hartwell, regardless of the medical testimony, the court will still consider the question of parental fitness. Your history of neglect—" "My history of grief," Victoria interrupted, "which is not the same thing no matter how you try to spin it. I lost my husband, Mr. Burke. I struggled to cope with that loss while also managing a multi-billion-dollar corporation and raising 2 children with severe disabilities. Yes, I made mistakes. Yes, I relied too heavily on professional caregivers. But I never stopped loving my daughters, and I never stopped trying to find ways to help them. She turned back to Richard. You want to fight, you'll get one. But I want you to understand something before you commit to this course. I am not the naive daughter-in-law you thought you could manipulate. I am the CEO of Hartwell Industries, a position I earned by building this company into something far more valuable than what you left behind. And I am the mother of two little girls who are finally starting to speak a development that you seem determined to undermine for the sake of your own ego. Richard's face had gone pale with rage. You don't know what you're doing, Victoria. The resources I can bring to bear, the connections I have in this state, I know exactly what I'm doing. I'm protecting my family. And if you want to spend the next year of your life in a courtroom dragging the Hartwell name through the mud of a public custody battle, that's your choice. But don't expect me to make it easy for you. She sat back down, her posture conveying dismissal. We're done here. You can show yourself out. Richard stood frozen for a long moment, his face working through emotions that ranged from fury to something that might have been grudging respect. Then he turned and strode toward the door, Burke scurrying behind him. At the threshold, Richard paused and looked back. This isn't over, Victoria. No, but it will be. And when it is, I want you to remember this moment. Remember that I gave you a chance to walk away to preserve whatever dignity you have left. Remember that you chose to fight, and remember that you lost. Richard left without another word, and Victoria sat alone in Jonathan's study, her hands trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion. She had thrown down the gauntlet. Now she would have to pick it up. The weeks that followed were a compressed education in the American legal system. Sarah Mitchell assembled a team of attorneys, paralegals, and expert witnesses coordinating strategy sessions that consumed Victoria's evenings and weekends. Discovery requests flew back and forth between the legal teams, each side demanding documents and depositions and access to information that the other side was reluctant to provide. Crawford found himself at the center of the maelstrom, his personal history dissected by Richard's legal team with the ruthless efficiency of surgeons searching for vulnerable tissue. His military records were subpoenaed, his medical files from the VA examined by hostile experts, his employment history scrutinized for any evidence of instability or incompetence. He bore it all with the stoicism that combat had taught him, answering every question honestly, providing every document requested, giving the opposition nothing to work with except the truth of who he was and what he had done. The picture that emerged from this examination was not that of a dangerous lunatic, but of a man who had served his country honorably, struggled with the invisible wounds of war, lost his wife to cancer, and devoted himself to caring for his disabled daughter with patience and love. Sarah Mitchell was delighted. They're building our case for us, she told Victoria during one of their strategy sessions. Every piece of evidence they demand about Crawford just reinforces the narrative of a dedicated father and caregiver. Richard's team is so focused on finding dirt that they're not seeing the gold they're digging up. What about his PTSD? Won't they try to use that against him? They'll try, but PTSD is not what it was 20 years ago. The public understands now that it's a normal response to abnormal situations, not a character flaw. And Crawford's management of his condition is exemplary. Regular VA appointments, medication compliance, no incidents of violence or erratic behavior. His treating psychiatrist is prepared to testify that he's one of the most stable PTSD patients she's ever worked with. And the mentally unstable veteran angle, Sarah smiled grimly. Let them try it. I have 3 decorated combat veterans ready to testify as character witnesses, including a Medal of Honor recipient who served with Crawford in Iraq. I'd love to see Richard's lawyers try to convince a jury that American war heroes are dangerous lunatics who shouldn't be around children. The depositions were grueling affairs conducted in conference rooms that felt like arenas for gladiatorial combat. Victoria sat through hours of questioning about her work schedule, her relationship with her daughters, her decision to bring Crawford into their lives. She answered every question with the controlled precision that had served her well in boardroom negotiations, giving the opposition nothing to work with. Crawford's deposition was equally intense. Richard's attorneys pressed him on his military service, his mental health history, his qualifications to work with disabled children. He remained calm throughout, his voice steady, his answers direct and unembellished. When they tried to rattle him with questions about the traumatic events he had witnessed in combat, He looked them in the eye and spoke with quiet dignity. I've seen things that no human being should have to see. I've done things that will haunt me for the rest of my life. But that's the nature of war. It leaves marks. The question isn't whether those marks exist, it's whether you let them define you or whether you find a way to grow around them. The attorney pressing him seemed momentarily taken aback by the response. Mr. Crawford, are you suggesting that your combat experiences have no bearing on your fitness to care for vulnerable children? I'm suggesting that my combat experiences taught me things that make me better at caring for vulnerable children. Patience in the face of impossible situations. Persistence when every logical assessment says to give up. The ability to see human beings clearly, to recognize their potential even when their circumstances seem hopeless. And these skills somehow translate to therapeutic work with disabled children. They translate to loving people who need loving. That's not as complicated as you're trying to make it sound. The deposition continued for hours, but Crawford never wavered, never lost his composure, never gave the opposition the emotional reaction they were clearly hoping to provoke. When it was over, Sarah Mitchell shook his hand with genuine admiration. You just won us the case, she said. Whatever happens from here, you just showed them who they're dealing with. The court date was set for December, just before the holiday season, a timing that Sarah believed would work in their favor. Judges were human beings, she explained, and human beings became more sentimental as Christmas approached. The image of a family fighting to stay together would resonate more powerfully in December than it would in the sterile rationality of spring. Victoria used the intervening weeks to strengthen every aspect of her case. She arranged for additional medical evaluations of Lily and Rose, documenting their continued progress with meticulous precision. She gathered character witnesses who could testify to her transformation over the past months, to her increased presence in her daughters' lives, to the visible changes in the household atmosphere. And she spent every possible moment with her children, not for strategic purposes, but because she had finally discovered what she had been missing for 5 years. The course of seeing Lily's face light up when she successfully pronounced a new word. The wonder of watching Rose reach for her mother's hand with deliberate intention. The laughter that filled the care room when Emma did something unexpectedly silly, and the twins struggled to imitate her. Crawford watched Victoria's transformation with the satisfaction of a gardener seeing his seeds finally bloom. He had done what he could to plant the possibility of change, but the growth itself was hers alone. She was becoming the mother her daughters deserved, and no court ruling could take that away. On the night before the hearing, Victoria found Crawford in the garden, standing at the stone bench where so many of their important conversations had taken place. The December air was cold, their breath visible in the moonlight, but neither of them moved toward the warmth of the house. Victoria spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. Are you ready for tomorrow? As ready as I can be. You bow. Terrified, but also something else, something I haven't felt in a long time. What's that? Victoria turned to face him, and in the pale light he could see the determination in her eyes, the fire that grief had nearly extinguished, but that love had rekindled. Hope. For the first time since Jonathan died, I feel like the future might actually be worth fighting for. Crawford nodded slowly. Helen used to say that hope wasn't about expecting things to go well. It was about believing that whatever happened, we could find a way through it. Smart woman, your wife. The smartest. He paused, then added quietly, she would have liked you, Victoria. She would have seen the same thing I see. What do you see? Crawford was silent for a long moment, weighing his words with the care of a man who understood that some things once spoken could not be taken back. I see someone who lost everything and refused to let that loss define her. I see someone who made mistakes and had the courage to acknowledge them. I see someone who is fighting not for pride or power or revenge, but for love, for the simple right to love her children and to build a life that means something. Victoria felt tears welling in her eyes, the weight of Crawford's words pressing against defenses that had been weakening for months. Sam. He raised a hand, stopping her before she could say whatever was forming in her mind. Not tonight. Tonight we need to focus on tomorrow. Whatever else there is between us, it can wait until the fight is over. She nodded, understanding what he was not saying as clearly as what he was. The connection between them had grown beyond employer and employee, beyond co-parents of children who were not biologically related. But acknowledging that connection now in the shadow of the hearing would only complicate matters. After tomorrow, she said quietly. After tomorrow, he agreed. They stood together in the cold December night, two people on the edge of something that neither of them fully understood, united by love for children who needed them, and by a growing recognition that they might need each other just as much. Inside the house, three little girls slept peacefully in their beds, unaware of the battle that would be fought on their behalf. Emma dreamed whatever dreams came to children whose bodies could not match the agility of their minds. Lily and Rose in their cribs side by side, as they had been since birth, breathed in synchronized rhythm, their newly discovered voices silent for now, but ready to speak again when morning came. And in the office of Thomas Burke, Richard Hartwell reviewed his legal strategy one final time, searching for the weakness he was certain must exist, the vulnerability that would allow him to reclaim what he believed was rightfully his. The pieces were in place. The players were ready. And tomorrow, in a courtroom in downtown Seattle, the fate of the Hartwell family would be decided. But that is a story for another time. For now, it is enough to know that love had been planted in barren soil, that hope had taken root where despair once flourished, and that a family was forming from the broken pieces of lives that the world had written off. Sometimes the most powerful transformations begin with a single word spoken in a silent room. Sometimes the bravest act is not fighting but staying. And sometimes the family we need finds us in the most unexpected places if we are only willing to open our hearts to the possibility. The morning of the hearing would bring new challenges and new revelations. But tonight, in the quiet of a December evening in Bellevue Hills, there was peace. And for people who had known so little of it, peace was enough. The King County Superior Courthouse rose against the gray December sky like a monument to the cold machinery of justice, its glass and steel facade reflecting the low clouds that pressed down upon Seattle with the weight of impending snow. Victoria Hartwell emerged from the black Escalade at precisely 8:45 before the scheduled start of the hearing, her heels striking the wet pavement with the measured rhythm of a woman who had long ago learned to project confidence even when her insides churned with terror. Samuel Crawford followed close behind, wearing the same dark suit he had worn to Helen's funeral 3 years ago, the fabric still carrying the faint memory of that terrible day when he had lowered his wife into the earth and wondered if he would ever find reason to wear formal clothes again. His face was composed, the mask of military discipline, firmly in place, but his eyes moved constantly across the crowd of reporters and photographers who had gathered at the courthouse entrance, piecing threats and escape routes with the automatic vigilance of a combat veteran. Sarah Mitchell met them at the security checkpoint, her expression grave but not defeated, the look of a general who knew the battle ahead would be bloody, but believed victory remained possible. She guided them through the metal detectors and up the elevator to the fourth floor, where courtroom 4B awaited with all its potential for salvation or destruction. Richard Hartwell was already seated at the opposing counsel's table when they entered, his silver hair immaculately styled, his charcoal suit probably costing more than Sam earned in 6 months. Thomas Burke sat beside him arranging documents with the fastidious precision of a man who believed that organization could compensate for moral bankruptcy. Catherine Hartwell occupied the front row of the gallery, her face arranged in an expression of maternal concern that fooled no one who knew the coldness beneath. The courtroom filled slowly with witnesses, observers, and members of the press who had been granted access to what the Seattle Times had dubbed the custody battle of the decade. Victoria took her seat at the plaintiff's table, Sam beside her, Sarah Mitchell, already on her feet, preparing for the opening statements that would set the tone for everything to follow. Judge Margaret Thornton entered at precisely 9 o'clock, her black robes flowing behind her like the wings of some great bird of judgment. She was 62 years old, a former family law attorney who had been appointed to the bench by a Democratic governor and had earned a reputation for cutting through legal theatrics to reach the human heart of every case that came before her. Sarah had told Victoria that Thornton was their best possible draw, a judge who valued substance over style, and who had little patience for wealthy litigants who tried to use the court system as a weapon. The gavel fell, and the hearing began. Thomas Burke delivered the opening statement for Richard's side, his voice smooth and persuasive as he painted a picture of a grieving widow who had retreated from her maternal responsibilities, leaving her vulnerable daughters in the crypt of rotating staff members while she pursued corporate ambitions. He spoke of developmental delays that might have been prevented With proper parental attention of recent decisions to entrust the children to an unqualified maintenance worker, with a documented history of mental health issues, of a pattern of neglect that demanded court intervention to protect two innocent lives. Victoria listened with her hands folded in her lap, her expression neutral, refusing to give Burke the satisfaction of visible reaction. She had heard these arguments before in depositions and legal briefs, and the sneering comments Richard made whenever he thought no one important was listening. The words still stung, still found the soft places where her guilt lived, but she had learned to absorb the blows without letting them knock her down. Sarah Mitchell's opening statement was shorter but more powerful, focusing not on the past but on the present and future. She spoke of transformation of a mother who had recognized her failures and committed herself to change. She spoke of medical evidence documenting remarkable progress in children whom experts had written off. And she spoke of Samuel Crawford not as a threat to the Hartwell children, but as a catalyst for healing a man whose patience and dedication had accomplished what millions of dollars in professional treatment had failed to achieve. The first witnesses were medical experts, and the testimony quickly became a battle of credentials and interpretations. Richard's team called Dr. Harold Pemberton, a pediatric neurologist from Stanford, who had evaluated Lily and Rose 2 years earlier, and concluded that their developmental prognosis was extremely limited. Under cross-examination, Sarah forced him to admit that he had not examined the children in over 18 months and was unaware of their recent progress. Victoria's team countered with Dr. William Foster from Johns Hopkins, who had evaluated the twins just 3 weeks ago and documented improvements that he described as unprecedented in my 30 years of practice. He testified that Lily and Rose were now producing multi-word sentences, responding appropriately to questions, and demonstrating cognitive abilities far exceeding what their original diagnosis had predicted. Burke tried to discredit Foster's testimony by suggesting that the recent progress was temporary, a statistical anomaly that would inevitably reverse. Foster responded with calm authority that the children's improvement was consistent with emerging research on neuroplasticity in young cerebral palsy patients, and that the therapeutic approach being used in the Hartwell household aligned with best practices currently being studied at major research institutions. The morning session ended with Victoria feeling cautiously optimistic, but Sarah warned her not to celebrate prematurely. The medical testimony was important, but it was not the heart of Richard's case. The real attack would come in the afternoon when they called Samuel Crawford to the stand. Sam ate lunch alone in a small conference room that Sarah had reserved for their team, unable to stomach the thought of food, but forcing himself to chew and swallow a sandwich that tasted like cardboard. Victoria found him there, standing at the window overlooking the city, his reflection ghostly against the glass. She crossed the room to stand beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. Neither spoke for a long moment, the silence between them charged with everything they had not yet said to each other. Victoria's voice emerged soft and steady. "Whatever happens in there this afternoon, I want you to know something." Sam turned to look at her, his expression guarded but attentive. "You saved my daughters. You saved me. Whatever Richard's lawyers try to do to you on that stand, whatever they dredge up from your past, none of it changes what you've done for my family. None of it changes who you are." Sam's jaw tightened, the muscle working beneath the skin. "I've made mistakes, Victoria. Done things I'm not proud of. They're going to put all of that on display this afternoon, and some of it is going to be ugly." "I know. Sarah warned me about the questions they're planning to ask. About Iraq, about your marriage, about the times you struggled with your PTSD. Victoria reached out and took his hand, feeling the calluses and the warmth, the strength that had held her daughters and sung them to sleep. "But I also know that the man who did those things is the same man who refused to give up on two little girls that everyone else had written off. The mistakes don't cancel out the good. They're part of the same story." Sam looked down at their joined hands, his expression softening. "Helen used to say something like that. She said that people aren't ledgers, that you can't just add up the good and subtract the bad to get a final number. She said that what matters is the direction you're moving, whether you're becoming more yourself or less." "And which direction are you moving?" Sam met her eyes, and in his gaze she saw something that made her breath catch. "Toward you, toward Lily and Rose and Emma, toward something that feels like home for the first time since I lost her." Victoria squeezed his hand, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. They stood together in the gray December light, two people on the edge of something case and terrifying and beautiful, drawing strength from each other for the battle still to come. The afternoon session began with Samuel Crawford taking the witness stand, his right hand raised as he swore to tell the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth. Thomas Burke approached the witness box with the predatory confidence of a man who believed he had already won. The questions started gently enough, establishing Sam's background, his employment history, his qualifications, or lack thereof, for working with disabled children. Burke's tone was almost friendly, lulling the courtroom into a false sense of civility before the real assault began. Then the question shifted. Burke's voice took on a sharper edge. "Mr. Crawford, you served in the United States Army from 2001 to 2008. Is that correct?" "Yes." "And during that time you were deployed to Iraq on two separate occasions?" "Yes." "You participated in combat operations, including the Second Battle of Fallujah in November 2004? "Yes." "And you witnessed significant violence during your deployments. Deaths, injuries, the kinds of traumatic events that leave lasting psychological impacts." Sam's expression remained neutral, though Victoria could see the tension in his shoulders. "I witnessed what every combat soldier witnesses. I did my duty." "Indeed. And after returning from your second deployment, you were diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. Were you not?" "Yes." "Can you describe for the court some of the symptoms you experienced as a result of this condition?" Sarah Mitchell rose immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Crawford's medical history is protected by privacy laws and is not relevant to the question of Mrs. Hartwell's fitness as a parent." Burke turned to the judge with practiced smoothness. "Your Honor, Mr. Crawford is now intimately involved in the care of two vulnerable children. His mental health is directly relevant to their safety and well-being." Judge Thornton considered for a moment, then nodded. "I'll allow the question, but counsel should be mindful of the witness's privacy rights. Mr. Crawford, you may answer to the extent you are comfortable." Sam took a breath and spoke with careful precision. "I experienced nightmares, flashbacks, hypervigilance, difficulty sleeping. I had trouble being in crowded places or loud environments. I startled easily at unexpected sounds." "And did you ever experience episodes of anger or aggression as a result of your condition?" "I had difficulty controlling my temper at times, yes, but I never harmed anyone." "Never harmed anyone physically, perhaps. But what about emotionally?" Burke picked up a document from his table. "Mr. Crawford, isn't it true that your wife, Helen Crawford, filed for a temporary separation in 2000? Citing your emotional unavailability and withdrawal as the primary reason?" The question hit Sam like a physical blow, and Victoria saw him flinch before his training kicked in and his expression went blank. This was the moment they had both dreaded, the exposure of his darkest failure before a room full of strangers. Sam's voice came out rough but steady. "Yes, Helen and I separated briefly in 2020. Briefly, for how long exactly?" 3 months. "And during that separation, where were you living?" "In a motel in Tacoma." "And what were you doing during those 3 months, Mr. Crawford? Were you seeking treatment for your mental health issues? Were you fighting to save your marriage?" Sam was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight of regret that made Victoria's heart ache. "No, I was running away. My wife had just been diagnosed with cancer, and I couldn't handle it. I was a coward." "A coward, your word, not mine." Burke let the statement hang in the air. "So when faced with a difficult situation involving someone you loved, your response was to flee, to abandon your responsibilities, to prioritize your own emotional comfort over the needs of your family." "Objection." Sarah was on her feet again. "Counsel is characterizing the witness's testimony in a misleading way." "Sustained. Mr. Burke, please stick to questions." Burke nodded, unperturbed. "Mr. Crawford, what brought you back to your wife after those 3 months?" Sam's eyes found Victoria's across the courtroom, drawing strength from her presence. "She called me. She was in the hospital getting her first round of chemotherapy, and she called to tell me that she forgave me, that she understood why I ran, and that she wanted me to come home." "And you went?" "Yes, I went home and I stayed with her until the end. I held her hand when she died, and I promised her that I would never run again." Burke nodded slowly, his expression suggesting that he had gotten exactly what he wanted. A touching story, Mr. Crawford, but it raises an important question. How can this court trust that you won't run again? How can we be certain that when things get difficult with the Hartwell children, when their care becomes burdensome or emotionally draining, you won't simply disappear the way you did when your wife needed you most? Sam straightened in the witness chair, his military bearing asserting itself. Because I learned something from that failure, Mr. Burke. I learned that running doesn't make the pain go away. It just adds regret to the pile. I learned that the only way through hard things is through them, not around them. Pretty words. But words are easy. Actions are what matter. Then look at my actions. Look at what I've done for the past 3 years. I've raised my daughter alone without running, without giving up, without letting her disability define the limits of what she could achieve. I've shown up every single day, even when it was hard, even when I wanted to quit. That's not words, Mr. Burke. That's a track record. Burke smiled thinly and returned to his table. No further questions. Sarah Mitchell approached the witness stand for redirect examination, her presence calming after Burke's assault. She guided Sam through a series of questions that allowed him to explain his treatment for PTSD, his consistent compliance with VA recommendations, his stable employment history since returning from Iraq. She had him describe his relationship with Emma, the daily routines they had established, the progress she had made under his care. And then she asked the question that would define the hearing. Sarah's voice was gentle but clear. Mr. Crawford, can you describe for the court what happened the first time you interacted with Lily and Rose Hartwell? Sam's expression softened the tension of Burke's cross-examination, giving way to something warmer. I was fixing a heating vent in the care room the second day of my employment. The girls were lying on a rug nearby, and I looked at them and saw something that reminded me of my own daughter. Not just the physical similarities, but something in their eyes, an awareness that nobody seemed to be acknowledging. What did you do? I knelt down beside them and introduced myself. I told them my name and said that I could see them, that I knew they were in there, even if they couldn't respond the way most people expected. And how did they react? They looked at me, really looked, not the vacant staring that their medical charts described. It was like nobody had spoken directly to them in a long time, and they were surprised that someone was finally trying. And that was when you began spending more time with them. Yes, I found reasons to pass through the care room during my workday. I would talk to them, sing to them, sometimes just be present. I did the same things I did with the Emma because it seemed like what they needed. Sarah paused, letting the courtroom absorb Sam's words. Mr. Crawford, in your opinion, what was missing from Lily and Rose's care before you arrived? Someone who believed in them. They had doctors and therapists and nurses, all very professional, all following established protocols. But nobody was treating them like children who had potential. They were being managed, not nurtured. And you changed that. I tried. I just applied what I'd learned with Emma, that these kids understand more than we think, that they're watching and listening even when they can't respond. You have to keep showing up, keep believing, keep treating them like people instead of patients. Sarah turned to address the judge directly. Your Honor, at this time, I would like to present video evidence documenting the progress Lily and Rose Hartwell have made since Mr. Crawford began working with them. The next 30 minutes transformed the hearing. A large screen was wheeled into the courtroom, and video after video played, showing Lily and Rose's development over the past months. Early clips showed them lying motionless, eyes unfocused, producing only involuntary sounds. Later clips showed them turning toward voices, reaching for objects, responding to questions with deliberate movements. And then the final clip played, recorded just 5 days earlier in the care room of the Hartwell estate. In it, Victoria sat on the floor between her daughters, holding their hands, while Sam sat nearby with Emma in her wheelchair. Victoria asked Lily if she wanted to hear a song, and Lily's voice came through the speakers, scratchy and effortful, but unmistakably clear. Yes, Mommy. Yes. Song, please. Victoria in the courtroom began to cry silently, the tears streaming down her face as she watched herself on screen begin to sing, as she watched Lily and Rose move their lips along with the melody, as she saw her daughters alive and present and fighting for every syllable. Judge Thornton watched the videos with an expression that gave nothing away, but Victoria noticed that she leaned forward slightly as the final clip played, her attention fully captured by the evidence unfolding before her. When the videos ended, Sarah Mitchell turned to the judge. "Your Honor, what you have just witnessed is not a temporary anomaly or a statistical fluke. It is the result of consistent patient loving care provided by both Mrs. Hartwell and Mr. Crawford. These children are thriving because they are finally being treated as human beings with potential, not as medical cases to be managed." Now, Thomas Burke rose for his closing argument, his composure slightly rattled, but still formidable. He argued that the progress, while encouraging, was insufficient to overcome the pattern of neglect that had characterized Victoria's parenting for 5 years. He argued that Samuel Crawford, despite his evident dedication, remained an unqualified caregiver whose mental health history posed ongoing risks. He argued that Richard and Catherine Hartwell, with their resources and stability, could provide a safer and more consistent environment for the children. Sarah's closing argument focused relentlessly on the present and future. She reminded the judge that family law was designed to serve the best interests of children, not the ambitions of grandparents. She pointed to the uncontested medical evidence showing unprecedented developmental progress, and she concluded with a simple question. "Your Honor, what would removing these children from the care of their mother and Mr. Crawford actually accomplish? Would it help Lily and Rose? Or would it simply punish Victoria Hartwell for the sin of being human, for struggling with grief in ways that every parent in this courtroom can understand?" Judge Thornton thanked both parties and announced that she would deliver her ruling the following morning after reviewing all evidence and testimony. The gavel fell and the hearing adjourned, leaving Victoria and Sam to navigate the gauntlet of reporters waiting outside. They drove back to the estate in silence, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down upon them. The day had gone better than Victoria had feared, but worse than she had hoped. The videos had been powerful, but Burke's attack on Sam's past had been effective, planting seeds of doubt that might blossom into a ruling against them. That evening, Victoria found herself in the care room, watching Lily and Rose sleep in their cribs, while the monitors beeped their steady rhythms. Sam appeared in the doorway, his tie loosened and his jacket removed, looking as exhausted as she felt. Victoria's voice was barely above a whisper. "What happens if we lose?" Sam crossed the room to stand beside her. "When we appeal, we fight, we don't give up." "But what happens to them? To Lily and Rose? If Richard takes them, if he puts them in some facility where nobody believes in them?" "That won't happen." Sam's voice carried a conviction that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than logic. "Whatever happens tomorrow, we'll find a way to protect them. That's what parents do." Victoria turned to look at him, and in the dim light of the care room, surrounded by the soft sounds of her daughter's breathing, she made a decision that had been building for weeks. She reached up and touched his face, feeling the roughness of stubble beneath her fingers, the warmth of skin that had known sun and sand, and the cold of too many lonely nights. "Sam." He went very still, his eyes searching hers. "Victoria, I know this isn't the right time. I know we should wait until after the ruling, until everything is settled. But I need you to know, whatever happens tomorrow, I'm not going anywhere. We're not going anywhere." She leaned forward and kissed him softly at first, then with increasing urgency, as months of suppressed emotion finally found release. Sam's arms came around her, pulling her close, and for a long moment they stood together in the darkness, two wounded people discovering that they could be whole again. When they finally separated, Sam's forehead rested against hers, his breathing ragged. "I've been wanting to do that for a long time." "I know, me too. This doesn't make things simpler." "No, it makes them more complicated, but also more worth fighting for." They stood together in the care room, watching over the children they had both claimed as their own, waiting for the morning that would determine the shape of their future. Outside, the December sky finally released the snow. It had been holding all day, white flakes drifting past the windows, like promises of transformation, covering the grounds of the Hartwell estate in a blanket of silent white. Whatever Judge Thornton's ruling brought, they would face it together. Whatever battles remained, they would fight them side by side. And whatever family they were becoming, they would continue to build it one day at a time, one word at a time, one act of love at a time. The night passed slowly, but the morning eventually came, as mornings always do, bringing with it the possibility of either destruction or deliverance, and the absolute certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. The morning of the verdict arrived with the kind of crystalline winter clarity that made everything seem sharper. more defined, as if the world itself had decided to strip away all softness in preparation for whatever judgment awaited. Victoria stood at her bedroom window, watching the sun rise over the snow-covered grounds of the estate, painting the white landscape in shades of gold and pink that seemed almost too beautiful for a day that would determine the fate of her family. She had not slept. After Sam had returned to the West Wing in the early hours of the morning, she had lain awake in her bed replaying the events of the hearing, analyzing every word of testimony, every expression on Judge Thornton's face, searching for clues to the ruling that would come. The kiss she and Sam had shared lingered on her lips like a promise, but even that warmth could not fully dispel the cold terror that gripped her heart. By 7 o'clock, she was dressed and downstairs, finding Sam already in the kitchen with George Morrison, both men nursing cups of coffee with the grim focus of soldiers awaiting orders to advance. Emma was still asleep in the West Wing, Rosa, the home health aide, watching over her, and Lily and Rose remained in the care room under Maggie's supervision, blissfully unaware that their futures hung in the balance of a judge's decision. The drive to the courthouse felt longer than it had the previous day, the winter roads slick with ice that made every turn feel treacherous. Victoria sat in the back of the Escalade with Sam beside her, their hands intertwined on the seat between them, neither speaking because words seemed inadequate to contain the magnitude of what they faced. Sarah Mitchell met them at the courthouse entrance, her expression carefully neutral, in a way that Victoria had learned to recognize as her lawyer's game face. They passed through security, rode the elevator to the fourth floor, and took their seats in courtroom 4B, where Richard Hartwell already waited with Thomas Burke, his silver hair gleaming under the fluorescent lights, his confidence apparently undimmed by the previous day's testimony. Judge Thornton entered precisely at 9 o'clock, and Victoria felt her heart climb into her throat as the bailiff called the court to order. The judge took her seat, arranged her papers, and surveyed the courtroom with an expression that gave nothing away. The judge's voice carried clearly through the silent chamber. "I have reviewed all evidence and testimony presented in this matter, and I am prepared to deliver my ruling. Before I do so, I want to address both parties directly." She turned first to Richard's table. "Mr. Hartwell, I understand your concern for your grandchildren's welfare. The loss of your son was a tragedy, and your desire to ensure that his daughters receive proper care is understandable. However, concern for children's welfare must be distinguished from desire for control over their inheritance and their mother's business decisions." Richard's face remained impassive, but Victoria saw Thomas Burke shift uncomfortably in his seat. The judge continued, "The evidence presented by your legal team regarding Mrs. Hartwell's past absences from her daughters' lives was concerning. However, it was also historical. The question before this court is not whether Mrs. Hartwell was a perfect mother 5 years ago, but whether she is providing adequate care for her children now, and whether she is capable of continuing to do so in the future." Judge Thornton turned to Victoria's table. "Mrs. Hartwell, the transformation you have undergone in recent months is evident and commendable. The video evidence of your daughter's progress is remarkable, and the testimony of medical experts confirms that Lily and Rose are developing in ways that exceed all prior expectations. Your decision to involve Mr. Crawford in their care, while unconventional, appears to have been instrumental in this progress." Victoria felt tears threatening and blinked them back, determined to maintain her composure until the ruling was delivered. The judge's expression hardened slightly. "However, I must also address a matter that came to my attention after yesterday's proceedings concluded. Last evening, my clerk received an anonymous communication alleging that certain evidence presented by the petitioners in this case was obtained through improper means." The courtroom stirred with murmured surprise. Richard's face went pale and Thomas Burke half rose from his seat before thinking better of it. Judge Thornton held up a document. Specifically, this communication provided evidence that the report filed with Child Protective Services regarding Mr. Crawford's care of his daughter Emma was fraudulent, submitted from an IP address traceable to the offices of Burke and Associates Counsel for the petitioners. The murmur in the courtroom grew louder. Victoria turned to look at Richard, whose mask of confidence had finally cracked, revealing the desperate calculation beneath. The judge's voice cut through the noise. "Order, I will have order in this court." The room fell silent. "I have reviewed the evidence provided in this anonymous communication, and I have independently verified its accuracy with the assistance of court technology specialists. The CPS report regarding Mr. Crawford was indeed submitted from Mr. Burke's office, and the allegations contained within that report have been determined by CPS investigators to be entirely without foundation. Thomas Burke was on his feet now, his composure shattered. Your Honor, I can explain. You will have an opportunity to explain, Mr. Burke, but not in this proceeding. I am referring this matter to the State Bar Association for investigation of potential ethical violations, and I am forwarding the evidence to the King County Prosecutor's Office for consideration of criminal charges related to filing false reports with a child protective agency. Burke sank back into his chair, his face ashen. Richard Hartwell sat rigid, staring straight ahead, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles stood out like cords. Judge Thornton removed her reading glasses and addressed the courtroom directly. The filing of false CPS reports is not merely an ethical violation. It is a crime that wastes precious resources meant to protect children who are actually in danger. It is also in this context evidence of bad faith that calls into question the entire foundation of the petitioner's case. She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. Based on the totality of evidence presented, including the medical testimony confirming Lillian Rose Hartwell's remarkable developmental progress, the video documentation of their current care environment, the testimony of Mr. Crawford regarding his methods and motivations, and the evidence of bad faith on the part of the petitioners, I hereby deny the petition for change of guardianship. Victoria's breath escaped in a sob she could not contain. Sam's hand tightened around hers, his grip almost painful in its intensity. Furthermore, the judge continued, I am issuing a restraining order prohibiting Richard and Catherine Hartwell from contacting Lillian Rose Hartwell without the express written permission of their mother. Any attempt to circumvent this order through legal action family members or other proxies will be considered contempt of court and will result in immediate sanctions. She gathered her papers and prepared to rise, then paused as if remembering something important. One final observation. In my 20 years on the bench, I have presided over hundreds of custody disputes, and I have learned to recognize the difference between litigants who genuinely care about children's welfare and those who are using children as pawns in larger conflicts. Mr. Hartwell, your actions in this case fall clearly into the latter category. You have wasted this court's time, you have caused unnecessary distress to your daughter-in-law and your grandchildren, and you have potentially exposed your legal counsel to criminal liability. I hope that in the time you have remaining, you will reflect on whether this was truly how you wish to honor your son's memory. The gavel fell with a sound like thunder, and Judge Thornton swept from the courtroom, leaving chaos in her wake. Victoria turned to Sam, tears streaming down her face, and found herself pulled into his arms in an embrace that communicated everything words could not express. Around them, Sarah Mitchell was accepting congratulations from colleagues. Reporters were scrambling to file their stories, and Richard Hartwell was being escorted from the courtroom by Thomas Burke, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. The drive back to the estate passed in a blur of relief and exhaustion, the winter landscape outside the windows now seeming welcoming, rather than threatening, the ice-covered roads leading home, rather than toward judgment. Victoria called ahead to share the news with George and Maggie, and by the time the Escalade pulled up to the main entrance, the entire household staff had gathered on the porch to welcome them. Victoria stepped out of the vehicle and was immediately engulfed in embraces, handshakes, and exclamations of joy. She accepted them all graciously, but her eyes kept drifting toward the second-floor windows, toward the care room where her daughters waited, unaware that their world had just been secured. She found Lily and Rose on their usual spot on the soft wool rug positioned for their morning therapy session, their eyes tracking her movement as she entered the room. Victoria lowered herself to the floor beside them, gathering them into her arms with a gentleness that belied the fierce protectiveness surging through her chest. Her voice came out thick with emotion. We won, my darlings. Nobody is going to take you away from me. We're going to be together, all of us, for as long as you need me. Lily's hand moved toward her mother's face, the trembling fingers finding Victoria's cheek and tracing the tracks of tears that had dried there. From the little girl's throat came a sound that made Victoria's heart stop. Mommy cry. Yes, sweetheart, Mommy is crying, but these are happy tears. Rose joined her sister, her own voice emerging with effort but clarity. Happy, Mommy happy. So happy. Mommy is so very happy. Victoria held her daughters close, breathing in their scent, feeling the warmth of their small bodies against hers. and she understood finally what Jonathan had tried to tell her in his letters, what Sam had tried to show her through his example, what she had been too consumed by grief and fear to recognize for 5 long years, that love was not about controlling outcomes or managing risks or protecting against loss, but about showing up, staying present, and believing in possibilities that the world insisted were impossible. The days that followed were a gradual transition from crisis mode to something approaching normal life. Sarah Mitchell handled the legal aftermath, filing the necessary documents to formalize the court's ruling and coordinating with the prosecutor's office regarding the investigation of Thomas Burke. Richard Hartwell retreated to his wing of the estate, his appearances in the main house becoming increasingly rare, his influence over household affairs diminishing with each passing day. Catherine Hartwell left for their vacation home in Florida 2 weeks after the ruling, citing health concerns that everyone understood to be code for inability to face the humiliation of their defeat. Richard would follow her eventually, Victoria knew, but for now he seemed paralyzed by the collapse of his schemes, unable to accept that his carefully constructed plans had crumbled so completely. Sam and Emma settled into the West Wing quarters with a permanence that felt both natural and miraculous. Emma's presence transformed the dynamic of the care room, her friendship with Lily and Rose deepening daily as the three girls developed their own language of gestures and expressions and halting words. The progress that had seemed so remarkable during the court hearing continued and accelerated each week, bringing new milestones that the medical team documented with growing wonder. Victoria restructured her work schedule to prioritize time with her daughters, delegating more responsibilities to her executive team and conducting meetings remotely whenever possible. She still ran Hartwell Industries with the same fierce competence that had made her a legend in Seattle business circles, but she no longer allowed the company to consume her entire existence. The balance she had always claimed was impossible turned out to be merely difficult, requiring intentionality and sacrifice, but rewarding her with a richness of experience that no quarterly earnings report could match. Her relationship with Sam evolved gradually, organically, without the dramatic declarations or grand gestures that Hollywood had taught her to expect from romance. They ate dinner together most evenings, discussing the children's progress and the challenges of the day and the thousand small details that made up family life. They watched movies after the children were asleep, sometimes talking through the entire film and sometimes sitting in comfortable silence. And occasionally, when the moment felt right, they found their way to each other in the darkness, discovering that the connection they had forged through shared struggle could sustain something tender and passionate as well. George Morrison watched these developments with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had lived long enough to recognize grace when he saw it. He had worried in the dark months after Jonathan's death that the Hartwell estate would become a mausoleum, a monument to loss and regret where nothing new could grow. Instead, it was becoming something he had never expected, a home, in the truest sense of the word, where broken people were learning to be whole again. One evening in early February, George sought out Sam in the garden, finding him at the stone bench beside the koi pond where so many important conversations had taken place. The winter had begun to loosen its grip on the Pacific Northwest, and the first signs of spring were visible in the budding branches and the lengthening days. George settled onto the bench beside the younger man, his old joints protesting the cold stone. For a long moment, neither spoke, watching the koi circle in their heated pond, their golden scales catching the fading light. George broke the silence. "You know, I've been working in wealthy households for nearly 40 years. I've seen more drama, more betrayal, more petty cruelty than most people encounter in a lifetime. But I've also seen moments of genuine grace, times when people manage to transcend their worst impulses and become something better than they were." Sam turned to look at him. "And this is one of those times. This is one of those times. What you've helped create here, the family that's taking shape in this house, it's something rare and precious. I wanted you to know that I see it and I'm grateful to have witnessed it. I didn't do it alone. Victoria did the hard work. The girls did the hard work. You showed them it was possible. You showed Victoria that she could be the mother she always wanted to be, and you showed those little girls that someone believed in them. That's not nothing, Sam. That's everything." Sam was quiet for a moment, absorbing George's words. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Helen used to say that the measure of a man isn't what he accomplishes when things are easy. It's what he does when things are impossible, when every logical assessment says to give up when the world is telling him that he's foolish to hope. She said that's when character reveals itself. Sounds like she was a wise woman, the wisest person I ever knew. Sam paused, looking up at the sky where the first stars were appearing. I think she would have liked what's happening here. I think she would have seen it as proof that what she believed was true, that love really is the only force that grows stronger when you give it away. George nodded slowly. I lost my son in Iraq, did I tell you that? You mentioned it. His name was Michael. He was 23 years old, a Marine like his father killed by an IED outside Fallujah in 2004. George's voice was steady, but Sam could hear the grief beneath it, still raw after nearly 2 decades. For a long time after he died, I wondered if anything I did mattered anymore. What was the point of managing households and organizing staff schedules when my boy was in the ground? How did you get through it? Jonathan Hartwell. He found me at my lowest point when I was about to quit and drink myself to death, and he sat me down and told me something I've never forgotten. He said, George, grief is not a destination. It's a passage. And the only way through it is to keep doing the next right thing, even when you can't see where the path leads. Sam smiled faintly. That sounds like something Helen would have said. Maybe there's a wisdom that certain souls share regardless of where they come from or how long they have to live. George rose from the bench, his knees cracking with the effort. I'm retiring at the end of the month. Victoria knows. I've trained my replacement, and the household will continue to run smoothly without me. Sam stood as well surprised. Where will you go? My daughter has a place in Arizona. Warm weather, no responsibilities, grandchildren to spoil. It's time for me to rest. George extended his hand, and Sam shook it firmly. Take care of this family, Sam. They need you more than you know. I will. George turned to walk back toward the house, then paused and looked over his shoulder. One more thing. Whatever happens between you and Victoria, make sure you're moving toward each other, not away. Life's too short and too unpredictable to waste time on fear. He disappeared into the gathering dusk, leaving Sam alone with the koi and the stars and the profound sense that something was ending, even as something else was beginning. The spring arrived slowly, as it always does in the Pacific Northwest, with fits and starts of warmth followed by retreats into gray dampness. But by April, the gardens of the Hartwell estate were in full bloom, the roses that Jonathan had planted finally tended with care by staff who understood their significance, their fragrance drifting through open windows and filling the house with sweetness. Victoria announced the creation of the Jonathan Hartwell Foundation at a press conference held on the estate grounds, surrounded by her daughters in their wheelchairs, Sam and Emma beside her, the assembled media capturing images that would appear in newspapers and websites across the country. The foundation would support families caring for children with disabilities, providing not just financial assistance, but also training in the therapeutic approaches that had transformed Lily and Rose's lives. Standing at the podium with the spring sun warming her face, Victoria spoke words that she had spent weeks preparing, words that summed up everything she had learned since that morning months ago when she had first heard her daughters call a stranger daddy. Her voice carried clearly across the assembled crowd. For years, I believed that loving my daughters meant protecting them from the world surrounding them, with experts and equipment and carefully controlled environments. I thought that if I spent enough money and hired enough specialists, I could somehow purchase the future that every parent wants for their children. She paused, looking down at Lily and Rose, whose eyes were fixed on her with an attention that still amazed her. I was wrong. What my daughters needed was not protection from the world, but engagement with it. They needed someone to look them in the eyes and see not a diagnosis, but a person. They needed patience that did not have a deadline, belief that did not require proof, love that did not count the cost. Victoria's gaze found Sam in the crowd, and she felt her heart swell with gratitude for everything he had taught her. I was lucky enough to find someone who understood these things instinctively, someone who had learned them through his own struggles and his own losses. Samuel Crawford showed me that the most powerful therapeutic intervention is not a technique or a technology, but a relationship. The simple act of showing up day after day, refusing to give up, believing in possibilities that the experts say are impossible, that is what heals broken children and broken families. She turned back to the crowd, her voice strengthening with conviction. The Jonathan Hartwell Foundation will carry forward my husband's vision and Sam's example. We will train parents and caregivers in approaches that prioritize connection over control, presence over performance. We will fund research into the remarkable plasticity of the developing brain, seeking to understand why some children exceed all expectations when given the right kind of support. And we will advocate for a world that sees children with disabilities not as problems to be managed, but as human beings with unlimited potential. The applause that followed her speech was warm and sustained, but Victoria barely heard it. Her attention was focused on her daughters, on their faces turned toward her with expressions of pride and love that no medical chart had ever predicted they would be capable of showing. After the press conference, after the reporters had departed and the catering staff had cleaned up and the estate had settled back into its evening quiet, Victoria found herself in the care room with Sam and all three girls. The spring twilight poured through the windows, painting everything in shades of gold and rose, and the room was filled with a peace that felt almost sacred. Sam sat on the floor with Emma in his lap, while Victoria held Lily and Rose on either side of her. The children were tired from the excitement of the day, their eyes growing heavy, their breathing slowing toward sleep. Victoria's voice was soft. "Did you ever imagine when you first walked into this house that it would lead to this?" Sam shook his head slowly. "I imagined nothing. I just did the next right thing the way Helen taught me. But this," he looked around at the room, at the children, at Victoria, "this is more than I ever dared to hope for." George said something to me before he left. He said that family isn't about blood, it's about who shows up when the night gets dark. He said something similar to me. I think he was right. Victoria reached across the space between them and took Sam's hand. "Whatever this is, whatever we're becoming, I want you to know that I'm grateful. For you, for Emma, for everything you've brought into our lives." Sam lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "The gratitude goes both ways. You gave me and Emma a home when we had nothing. You believed in me when the world was trying to tear me down. That's not nothing, Victoria. That's everything." Lily stirred against her mother's side and murmured something that made both adults freeze. "Family." Rose echoed her sister, the word emerging with the effort that every syllable still required. "Family." Emma, nearly asleep in her father's arms, added her own contribution. "Love." Victoria felt tears streaming down her face, but she made no move to wipe them away. She looked at Sam and saw that his eyes were wet as well, the hardened combat veteran finally allowing himself to feel the full weight of the grace that had entered his life. No more words were needed. They sat together in the fading light, two adults and three children who had found each other through circumstance and chosen each other through love, watching the spring evening deepen into night, and knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Outside the windows of the care room, the roses bloomed in the garden that Jonathan had planted. Their fragrance carried on the warm spring breeze, like a blessing from someone who could no longer be present, but whose love still reached across the divide between worlds. And in the hearts of those who remained, a new chapter was beginning, written not in the language of loss and grief, but in the vocabulary of hope and healing, and the stubborn, miraculous persistence of love. The night settled over the Hartwell estate, soft and warm and full of promise. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new milestones, new moments of struggle and triumph. But tonight there was only peace, only gratitude, only the quiet certainty that some things once lost can be found again, and that some families forged in fire can emerge stronger than any that blood alone could create. And somewhere in the space between memory and hope, Helen Crawford and Jonathan Hartwell smiled at what their loved ones had built, knowing that the greatest legacy any person can leave is not wealth or power or fame, but the courage to love without reservation and the wisdom to recognize that every ending is also a beginning. The story of the Hartwell family was far from over, but the hardest part, the part that required them to choose love over fear and hope over despair, that part was done. Whatever came next, they would face it together as a family, bound not by obligation or genetics, but by something far more powerful and far more rare. By choice, by commitment, by love. And that, in the end, is all that any family really needs.